morning before we ever got to farming side, but had a new bull show up for a conjugal visit with the heifer we've got, or the older heifer. The two younger ones aren't quite ready to be bred, but she was glad to have company. So had that. We got other stuff. Jeremy, you get any farm work done today?
Yeah, I got a good bit of miscellaneous stuff. Project started. I'm going to work on some more of them tomorrow, doing some fencing and whatnot to make a new section for the chickens and separate it from where the goats are going to be and all that stuff. So, yeah.
Very nice. Who else gets tomorrow off? Y'all have tomorrow off?
Oh, I got tomorrow off tomorrow. So
nice.
Oh, it's nice. We'll spend a little time with the family and relax a little bit.
How's your baby girl doing?
She's doing real well and growing now. She's starting to kick in and start growing now and gaining weight and just starting to react to the to her older sisters now. So she's doing well, and we're thankful to Father Yada. He blessed her and enabled her to be able to recover, and she's doing pretty good for 3 months. Yep.
Excellent. Amen. And Brother Gatewood, the Queen City is still there, I suppose.
Yeah, it's still surviving through all the storms and stuff. It's still standing. So.
I'm gonna have to make a trip up there sometime in the very near future. If it works out, I'll give you a shout, let you know I'm coming. Maybe we can get together for a minute.
Yeah, I definitely enjoy it. As you know, I've been trying to get things together so I can actually get down there to you, see all that beautiful land and walk that trail you walk, man.
Yeah. Don't be surprised if Brother Jerry and myself won't be coming down there together.
Listen, man, I keep telling you, I will carve out a corner of the property here for you, brother. Come on.
All right.
I keep praying that the Father will give us or place in our path a large piece of property that we can then subdivide for other brothers that want to be here or desire to be nearby. Yeah. So good stuff.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got a hot topic tonight. We've got this is going to be a fun one. We've got a lot of research behind this. I have to give a big shout out to Brother Jan. I appreciate his research ability so much. I appreciate I appreciate the archive that you've got.
Yeah,
it's like
absolutely.
Yeah, it's massive. His library is off the charts.
His head has got to be this big to hold all that stuff. I'm telling you. But I was looking at like the last article that I've got this evening to look at. I was reading it. And I said, man, I've seen this before. I saw this years ago. I can remember seeing what I saw, but I don't remember where I saw it. But I'm telling you, Brother Jan, you bring up a topic. He's like, I got an article for that, and I got an article for that, and I got good stuff.
Praise God, brother. Yeah,
he's looking at articles.
So one of the topics that we all of us here in the room on this stream, one of the topics we're passionate about is the restoration of Kol Israel. We desire to see the restoration of the kingdom, because part of that is necessary for the return of the king, right? And so we're passionate about that. And I know that a lot of times people get excited or excitable when we start discussing it because there's so many facets, and a lot of times we can be myopic in our approach. And so tonight, what we want to do as a group of brothers is to go through a whole bunch of different information. And I pray that this will be a blessing to everyone who takes the time to listen, who takes the time to watch, who takes the time to go into the show notes. We've already got all of our research in the articles that we're going to be working with, plus additional resources. And this will be the beginning. This will be the first part of a larger body of work. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the scattering. Who is Israel, the scattering? And in a couple weeks, we will come back and talk about who is Israel, the gathering. And then somewhere beyond that, I think we're going to have another wrap-up piece to help pull these things together. But what we want what we really want to do is share some experience, share some knowledge and information. Anything y'all want to add at the beginning of this before we open this can, because it's going to be a big one.
I think for me personally, this was something close to my heart. For years, I did research on my own personal family, our lineage on both sides of my family, and came to some amazing conclusions over time. And it all started, I'm in my, about 50 now, and it all started back when I was 19. I was told something, and I didn't believe it at the time, and ever since then, the Father has just revealed piece by piece that really shows how wide and how large the scattered of the kingdom of Israel actually is. And so, over the years, I've been able to collect material and add to my own experience. And, one of my hopes is, the thing that I hope for is that something in the material that we have today and from all of our shared research might be a point that might be beneficial for other people and, add to the edification of the assembly, no matter which arm of the assembly you may be, whether it's Messianic, whether it's Hebrew Israelite. There's details that you may not know. So we hope that in some of this information and uncovering some of these and turning over some of these stones, might be some material that's really beneficial, that shows you that the family is much wider than you might expect.
Man.
Yeah,
Another point I want to mention, we're gonna stay fairly narrowly focused on the specific articles that we're reading and the specific topics we're trying to attack. We have an outline that we're going to be going by, and so we may or may not at some point throughout the stream mention different groups and their let's see, how do I want to put this, their failings, their shortcomings, and what that means as far as their status of being Israel or not, and things of that nature. A common one that is something that we we'll address in the future is the modern nation state of Israel, for instance. There's a large number of people there that are fully embracing homosexuality, transgenderism. There's a large number of people there that are rejecting Yeshua as Messiah. All of those things have an impact on this. So please don't assume that because we may not address it, that means we endorse it. We don't. So it may simply be outside the scope of what we're talking about today. So we don't endorse debauchery. We don't endorse rejecting Yeshua. Any of that. And there's problems in a large number of groups who call themselves Israel. And we may or may not address those different problems as we go. So
another quick caveat that I'd like to throw out there at the beginning, it occurs to me that, of course, some of the articles that we're using come straight out of mainstream Christendom. And so the language that they use isn't always biblically correct. And certainly as a group, we understand the difference between the house of Israel and the house of Judah. We understand that a lot of times in terms of Jews, it's not necessarily Israel. It's part of Israel, but not all of Israel. And so, I understand too that there are going to be some things that we may have to dip into language-wise as we go through this, because there are too many people that don't understand what their Bible actually says with regards to the house of Israel, the house of Judah, how both are part of Kol Israel or all Israel. I like to use that term, Kol Israel, and that would be the people of Yah, is Kol Israel, right? And sometimes we can call them Hebrews, we can call them Israelites, these other things, but we recognize that at the end of the day, his people are, we'll get to where we identify who Israel is, and that's going to come a little farther along. So, all right. Anything else y'all want to put out there before we get started?
Yeah, just go into this with the open mind, and go into this with the teachable spirit. These guys have put together one heck of a show for you guys with articles and slides and it's full of information. And this is something that Israel actually needs right now. So don't go into this with being closed minded and thinking that you can't be taught anything new. These brothers are well studied, full of the spirit of wisdom, and that's exactly what you guys are going to get tonight. So I thank the brothers on the panel. I thank everybody else for coming on to watch us live. But as Brother Mike would say, don't keep that love all to yourself. Be sure to hit that share button.
Yes, sir.
And get the message out.
All right, so we do have, as we go through, we've got a couple different little short videos. Some are shorter than others, but we're going to start off, we're going to lead off with a quick little video to kind of help set the stage for where we're headed in this first segment. So let me do a quick screen share here. And I'm going to do...
In terms of human history, deep human biological history, Africa has a special role as a place of the emergence of modern humans, whether from a single population that has crossed the threshold and diversified, or whether from multiple populations that have intermixed to create the fundamental basis of modern humanity. Ancient Nubia and ancient Egypt share roots, common cultural roots in Northeast Africa, in the Sahara, and along the Nile Valley. The ancient Egyptians and the ancient Nubians can both be described, especially in the earlier periods, as being descendants of Northeast African indigenous population. As one writer said, all of these people are Africans, and I define Africans as people whose biological histories have emerged and their identities have emerged in Africa, and where any mixing that took place on African soil. The Egyptians did not come from any place else other than the Nile Valley. Their identities and any other ancestry that they may have had were all forged together in that space. One becomes better known, and one's writing becomes translatable, which is purely an accident, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Otherwise, we would not be able to read the Egyptian hieroglyphs as well. So they would still be a mystery as well. We have not recovered something similar for later period Nubia. I don't think in terms of race in general. I don't, and when I say this, I think about it in two different ways. Darwin essentially suggested that in order to say that a species was subdivided into subspecies, which would be the equivalent of races, that the populations involved would have to be almost incipient species. Okay. So a high degree of substructure. I can tell you that you cannot use the idea of any difference or being able to tell a difference, either at the molecular level or physical level, as indicative of or requiring the use of the term race. So I say there are populations, but no races, and I'm not the first person to say that. All of these people are connected to each other, and dividing them in a way that implies a level of discreteness that the term race implies is inappropriate. Were there people with darker skin, lighter skin, curlier hair, less curly hair? Yes, there were. There is no evidence that the ancient Egyptians who did medicine, who made observations, and sometimes detailed artwork about the environment around them, animals, plants, there's no evidence that they had a theory of human variation that would be commensurate or similar to notions of race as they were developed in Europe. There's a deep shared ancestry in the Sahara of these societies. The fact that they were sometimes in conflict we should not impose our reasons, our ways of thinking onto why this conflict may have occurred. The conflicts were political, social, probably over the same issues. Let's not read ideological ideas about the reason of this conflict back into the past. We have to avoid stereotypes. We have to avoid the old ways of thinking, but just put into new data sets or new types of data, which I do believe that we can see in literature sometimes today, you know. And I think that a lot of times, if you look very carefully at the scientific literature, you'll see that sometimes the old ways of thinking are lurking beneath the surface there. And this is something that needs to be addressed.
All right. So, any comments there before we move forward?
That kind of sums it up right there, doesn't it?
On the subject of race, I'm reminded of something that when I was growing up, there was at the church I was attending at the time, and specifically the Christian school, there was someone who came from a ministry that was nearby and did a presentation, and basically, ultimately the conclusion that he presented and promoted was that there's, when it comes to human beings, there's one race. It's the human race. The diversity of color and different physical features that we see it all comes from Adam and Eve, and ultimately, obviously, Noah and his sons. So this division into different races based on skin tone, physical features, things of that nature, is erroneous. And ultimately, as far as race is concerned, we're all one race. We're all human beings. So.
And I think that fits the biblical record, from my perspective, being in medicine, understanding how the body works, understanding human biology. I can tell you from an experiential standpoint, after 25 plus years, that you truly are the same race. You're of the same seed. I think because of sin and moving away from Torah, people have gotten outside of Yah's understanding of how culture is to work, or how his creation is to work. So I think what that first visual aid or that first presentation really sets is the course, the idea that most conflicts are political, right? They're not necessarily ontological issues that you're dealing with. You're dealing with political, social, resource-based arguments. And because you have those disagreements, people can develop mythologies to support their political or covert reasons to undermine other cultures, so to speak. So I think when he looks at history, one of the points that he made was that we in the West, because we live in a modern era, cannot impose our presupposition of what we have been cooked in into the past to imagine that they think the same way we do.
Right.
And so I think you have to always have checks and balances on the way you think, so that you don't read into the text something that isn't there.
Yeah, one of the things that I see that he pointed out also is that, when it comes to this situation of race, that is really a relatively new phenomenon or thing that's taught. Actually, one of the main proponents of it in the beginning, in its inception, has been the Roman Catholic Church, in the 15th century, starting this idea of categorizing a whole mass of people based on skin color. And so this is how we get to where we are today. If you don't dig further back into history, you're not going to really, get that understanding looking at it from a Western perspective.
All right. So, Mr. Gatewood, first article up.
All right.
Let's see how well I can navigate all of this stuff over here.
Let me know when you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so this first one is diaspora. And it reads, diaspora was the name given to the countries outside of Palestine, through which the Jews were dispersed, and secondly to the Jews living in those countries. The Greek term diaspora corresponds to the Hebrew meaning of exile, referenced in Jeremiah 24, verse 5. It occurs in the Greek version of the Old Testament, e.g. Deuteronomy 28:25 and 30, verse 4, where the dispersion of the Jews among the nations is foretold as the punishment of their apostasy. And that simply means an abandonment of belief. In John 7:35, the word is used implying disdain. The Jews therefore said among themselves, whither will he go, that we shall not find him? Will he go unto the dispersed among the Gentiles? Two of the Catholic epistles, viz. that of James and First Peter, are addressed to the neophytes of the diaspora. In Acts 2 are the enumerated, the principal countries from which the Jews came who heard the apostles preach at Pentecost, everyone in his own tongue. The diaspora was the result of the various deportations of Jews, which invariably followed the invasion or conquest of Palestine. The first deportation took place after the capture of Samaria by Shalmaneser, and it's in parentheses, Salmanasar, and Sargon, when a portion of the 10 tribes were carried into the regions of the Euphrates into Media in 721 BC. And you can see that in 2 Kings 17. In 587 BC, the kingdom of Judah was transported into Mesopotamia. When about 50 years later, Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to their country, only the poor and more fervent availed themselves of the permission. The richer families remained in Babylonia, the beginning of the numerous and influential community. The conquest of Alexander the Great caused the spreading of Jews throughout Asia and Syria. Seleucus Nicator made the Jews citizens in the cities he built in his dominions, and gave them equal rights with the Greeks and Macedonians. Josephus Antichus 731. Shortly after the transportation of Judah into Babylonia, a number of Jews who had been left in Palestine voluntarily immigrated into Egypt. And that's referenced in Jeremiah 42 through 44. They formed the nucleus of the famous Alexandrian colony. But the great transportation into Egypt was effected by Ptolemy Soter, and Ptolemy took many captives, both from the mountainous parts of Judea and from the places about Jerusalem and Samaria, and led them into Egypt and settled there. In Rome, there was already a community of Jews at the time of Caesar. It is mentioned in a decree of Caesar cited by Josephus after the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus. Thousands of Jews, Jewish slaves, were placed upon the market. They formed the nucleus of settlements in Africa, Italy, and Spain, and Gaul. At the time of the apostles, the number of Jews in the diaspora was exceedingly great. The Jewish author of the Sublime Oracles, Josephus, mentioning, forgive me, I skipped one. The Jewish author of the Sublime Oracles could already say of his countrymen, every land and every sea is full of them. Josephus mentioned the riches of the temple, says, let no one wonder that there was so much wealth in our temple, since all the Jews throughout the habitable earth sent their contributions. The Jews and the diaspora paid a temple tax, a kind of Peter's pence, a didrachma, being required from every male adult. The sums transmitted to Jerusalem were at times so large as to cause an inconvenient drainage of gold, which more than once induced the Roman government either to stop the transmittance or even to confiscate it. Through the diaspora, Jews were, on the whole, faithful to their religion. There was a noticeable difference of theological opinion between the Babylonian and Alexandrian Jew. The Mesopotamian Jews read and studied the Bible in Hebrew. This was comparatively easy to them, since Chaldee, their vernacular, was kindred to the Hebrew. The Jews in Egypt and throughout Europe, commonly called Hellenistic Jews, soon forgot Hebrew, a Greek version of the Bible. The Septuagint was made for them. The consequence was that they were less ardent in punctilious observance of their law. Like the Samaritans, they showed a schismatic tendency by erecting a rival temple to that in Jerusalem. It was built by the son of Onias, the high priest, in Leontopolis in Lower Egypt, during the reign of Ptolemy and Philometor, 160 BC, and was destroyed 70 BC. It is a curious fact that whereas Hellenistic Judaism became the soil in which Christianity took root and waxed strong, the colony of Babylonia remained a stronghold of Orthodox Judaism and produced its famous Talmud. The deeply rooted antagonism between the Jews and Greeks made the amalgamation of the two races impossible. Though some of the Seleucids and Ptolemies, such as Seleucus, Nicator, and Antiochus the Great, were favorable towards the Jews, there was constant friction between the two elements in Syria and Egypt. Occasionally, pillage and sacrifice were the inevitable result. Thus, on one occasion, the Greeks in Seleucia and Syria massacred some 50,000 Jews. On another occasion, the Jews, getting the upper hand in Cyprus, killed the Greek inhabitants in Salamis, and were in consequence banished from the island. In Alexandria, it was found necessary to confine the Jews to a separate quarter or ghetto. The Roman Empire was on the whole well disposed toward Jews of the diaspora. They had everywhere the right of residence and could not be expelled. The two exceptions were the exclusion of the Jews from Rome under Tiberius and under Claudius, and that's referenced in Acts 18:2. But both these instances were of short duration. Their cult was declared a religio licia. All communities had their synagogue. Preshukmai or Saptia. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing it. The translation might be poor, I read. Which served also as libraries and places of assembly. The most famous was that in Antioch. They had their cemeteries in Rome. Like the Christians, they buried their dead in catacombs. They were allowed freely to observe their Sabbaths, festivals, and dietary laws. They were exempt from the emperor worship and from military service. Many Jews enjoyed Roman citizenship. St. Paul, and that's referenced in Acts 16:37-39. In many places in the Jewish community, a recognized organization with administrative, judicial, and financial powers. It was ruled by a council called Garosha, composed of elders, presbytery, at the head of which was the archon. Another token of the freedom which the Jews enjoyed throughout the empire was their active propagandism. And that's he was referencing Matthew 23:15. The neophytes were called Phobomenoi or Sabomenoi, i.e. God-fearing. It's referenced in Acts 13:16, 26, and verse 43 there. Their numbers appear to have been very great. St. Paul met them in almost all the cities he visited. Josephus praising the excellence of the law says the multitude of mankind itself has had a great inclination to follow our religious observances. There is not a city of the Grecians or Siberians where our customs and the prohibition as to our food are not observed, etc. Many of the converts were distinguished persons, e.g., Agula, the chamberlain of the Queen Candace, and it is referenced in Acts 8:26 here. Azizus, king of Amase, and Polemo, king of Sicilia, and the patrician Lady Fulvia. That's the end of that article.
All right, so one of the things that we definitely see there, the article acknowledges that the diaspora, a lot of times we hear the diaspora expressed through the lens of whoever happens to be doing the expressing, and they often don't do a good job of recognizing that the scattering of Israel, part of which was the Northern Kingdom in 722, and then after that, the Southern Kingdom partially in 586 with the deportation to Babylon, and then later, especially after the Roman conquest in 70 AD and beyond, 135 after the Bar Kokhba rebellion.
Bar Kokhba.
Ultimately, what we see is the scattering going in every direction. Part of that we can see from Acts chapter 2. Where did they come from? They came from Gaul, which is today Great Britain. They came from Spain. They came from Italy and from Greece. They came from parts of Persia, but they also came from Libya and from Egypt and from Cush and there are multiple places like that listed right there in Acts chapter 2. So every direction is where they were sent, and every direction ultimately, as we look at this, is where they're going to come back from. But yeah, that article hits on a number of those pieces in terms of talking about, slave ships to Rome, just like slave ships later on elsewhere. And then we're going to see settlements all across North Africa, settlements across southern, the northern borders of the southern part of Europe, the northern borders of the Mediterranean, all along those coasts, everything. Yeah.
Excellent article, Brother Jim.
Good read.
Yeah, it really was. Just in that article alone is telling you, or it's really demonstrating to us that not only is Israel a mixed bag, but everybody didn't just come from one place. There really was a scattering that took place, and it just from the names in the article, there are people in here that you wouldn't even expect to be considered Israel or wrapping in. So yeah, very, very good information.
All right, you got one more there for us, Brother Gatewood.
Yes, sir. Got it pulled up here.
titled Genes Tell the Tale of Jewish Ties to Africa.
Yep, and it starts out and it says in the book of Kings, Solomon is depicted as an international businessman of sorts who sent ships from the port of Etion, Geber, near modern-day Eilat, to trade precious metals and other goods with various parts of the world, including Africa. Solomon also famously received a visit from the Queen of Sheba, who is thought to be from what is presently Ethiopia. Now, a new scientific paper offers a genetic timeline that could support these biblical tales. The paper builds on two studies published last summer that were the first to use genome-wide analyses to trace the history of the Jewish people through DNA. It demonstrated that there was a biological basis for Jewishness, said Dr. Harry Osterer, director of the Human Genetics Program at the New York University School of Medicine, who led one of the studies. Among its many findings, Osterer's paper indicated that Jews have African ancestry, an observation that David Reich, associate professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School, and his colleagues decided to explore further. Reich's team analyzed more than 500,000 DNA markers across the entire genomes of people from 7 diverse Jewish populations, including Ashkenazi from Northern Europe, Sephardim from Italy, Turkey, and Greece, Mizraim from Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They then compared the genetic data with DNA from 15 sub-Saharan African populations. Reporting in the April issue of the Pelos Genetics, the researchers found that modern-day Jews can attribute about 3 to 5% of their ancestry to sub-Saharan Africans, and that the exchange of genes between Jews and sub-Saharan Africans occurred approximately 72 generations, or about 2,000 years ago. Priya Morjani, a doctoral student in Reich's lab who led the research and was surprised that the degree of African DNA was so consistent across the various Jewish populations. She had expected, for example, that North Africa and Middle Eastern Jews would have a greater degree of genetic mingling than Europeans based on their geographical proximities. So the findings, Morjani said, may point to a shared ancestry among the various Jewish groups. It's definitely suggestive that most Jewish populations have a common ancestral population, she said. Although the Harvard team couldn't determine where exactly the exchange of genes took place, the results complement historians' understanding of the Jewish narrative. This is interesting, and it gives me food for thought, said Norman Stillman, a professor of Judaic history at the University of Oklahoma. Does it prove something historically specific beyond the fact that we know that the Jewish bloodline was open to some extent throughout history? No, but it fits in with the rest. Lawrence Skiffman, a professor of Hebrew and Judaic studies at Yeshiva University, said 2 time periods came to mind that could support the geneticist findings. The first is during the First Temple period between about 950 BCE and 600 BCE, when Solomon's kingdom would have had contact with Africans, or Scriptman said mixing of populations could have taken place a bit later, during the Hellenistic period, from about 320 BCE to 30 BCE, when Jews were living all over the southern shore of the Mediterranean Sea and could have come in contact with Africans to the south of them. Yet, even though the biblical accounts offer possible explanation for the Reich Lab's findings, Skiffman stresses that he and the other social scientists can only offer historical interpretations of the genetic data. The facts are the ones that scientists are developing. The theories are what historians have, he said. We now have to take what they are giving us and we have to add it to our picture of history. Stillman pointed out that the Jews are often thought of as an insular group because they tended to marry within their community. But he said that doesn't mean there wasn't all throughout history an inflow of others into the group. As Reich sees it, genetics and history are not actually so disparate. His work, he said, is a kind of complementary way of studying history. So,
yeah, so I think what's interesting about that is that when you actually get down into the research, I mean, one thing that was telling is that, you know, at least in their findings, they looked at about 72 generations, and it went that far back at least. And so it shows you that you had these diverse populations that were interacting with each other. So yes, we understand from Torah the set apart nature of Israel. However, we also understand from Torah that there were multiple, so to speak, ways to be integrated into society, right? You can look at the idea of the Edomite coming in the third generation. You can look at the idea of even when Esther was with, you know, in the Persian aspect of captivity, the idea that even then when Mordecai and Esther had their witness in a foreign land under captivity, how in chapter 8 it says, and many people of the land became Jews. It doesn't say they wanted to be. The text writes, the text reads as they became, right? So you see this idea that yes, you had a set apart people, but then there were ways and opportunities where others came in ancient times, right? So if you look at graveyards from an ancient setting, you may very well find multiple groups in a founding population that may not just tie back to one man or one woman there. So I think that was interesting. So it's as if they're discovering this now, right? Maybe it was known in the ancient world, then disappeared during the time period of diaspora and scattering. But now, as we come to this point in time, we have an accumulation of knowledge that is coming back to us, so that people are beginning to wake up not only on who they are from an ethnic or genetic aspect, but also what that means from a walking in Messiah and through his Torah aspect too. So I think that kind of sets the scale for the rest of our talk as well.
And one of the points too, I think, is that, you know, we look at this at Scripture. The Father said that he would gather the seed of Abraham from the ends of the earth, and it seems very clear that it was his intent to sow the seed of Abraham and the seed of Jacob into the earth, and then be able to harvest from all over the earth. So we shouldn't be surprised when we see connections and or entire population groups on every continent, except for maybe Antarctica, that have Israelite heritage. And I want to say that more specifically than just Jewish heritage, because, you know, of course, we understand that the term Jew and the term Israelite, Jews are Israelites, but not all Israelites are Jews, right? So that's something for us to remember.
The thing that stands out for me with this is, you know, given long before 70 AD, there's been a pervasive scattering of Israel. And with this scattering being so broad and so pervasive and so dense, it kind of like screams out to me the idea that, you know, Yah has intended that we be so diverse to the point that it emphasizes that in order for us to recognize each other, we must first recognize each other based on what Torah says, based on the attributes of the fruit of keeping what Torah says and faith in the promised seed, which is Messiah. Do you bear that fruit? And that is the number one indicator. We can talk about the DNA, we can talk about the haplotype, we can talk about all of that, but the number one indicator is, do you bear the fruits? Do you bear the markings?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Amen. And Dr. Murray
Absolutely.
alluded to that in a couple of her comments there as well. And if nothing else, one of the things that I really want to see is I want to see us understand that, we are brothers, and we're brothers more than just because one or the other was grafted in, but because the seed was scattered everywhere, and we have to learn to recognize each other as brothers. But we ultimately, and we will find this as we get deeper into this conversation, is that we recognize each other by what we do and the faith that we have.
Yes.
It has nothing to do with this right here, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Faith in
So,
action. That's how we
Let me put up the next little clip. Keep this thing moving along. This is going to be a short clip that let's see right here, and I'll probably play it twice. It actually I can't figure out how on these shorts when I've got it on here to back it up and start it over, and I think it's a couple seconds in, so we'll play this thing through twice here right quick.
Make us living today the last generation not to know who the lost tribes really were all along. Sometimes even the most destructive rhetoric always contains a grain of truth. Yes, there is validity that many people of color in North and South America and the Caribbeans have Israelite ancestry. And there is an undeniable movement of return consciousness that is getting these descendants to wake up. However, when that is weaponized and aimed at attacking the other Jewish people who were also sold on slave ships to Rome and who have been persecuted and massacred for generations in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, you get two Israelite groups fighting each other and blaming the other for the source of their suffering, rather than reuniting and never actually holding accountable those who truly still benefit from our struggles. Yea, if you are really part of Am Yisrael, be a part of the generation and our movement to link the family back together. We are uncovering and documenting these stories to make us living today the last generation not to know who the lost tribes really were all along. Sometimes even the most destructive rhetoric always contains a grain of truth. Yes, there is validity that many people of color in North and South America and the Caribbeans have Israelite ancestry. And there is an undeniable movement of return consciousness that is getting these descendants to wake up. However, when that is weaponized and aimed at attacking the other Jewish people who were also sold on slave ships to Rome and who have been persecuted and massacred for generations in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, you get two Israelite groups fighting each other and blaming the other for the source of their suffering, rather than reuniting and never actually holding accountable those who truly still benefit from our struggles. Yea, if you are really part of Am Yisrael, be a part of the generation and our movement to link the family back together. We are uncovering and documenting the.
Okay. Amen. Passionate
Amen.
presentation there, but so true that the Father is doing something incredible and pulling people together from all over the world. And it's exciting. That's very exciting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Amen.
Man, amen. Now,
go ahead.
Yeah. Now, going on to my article. So this first article, I'm going to deal more with the genetics, digging down into what the what the current literature is talking about in terms of the genetics, and in terms of, how do you go about just reviewing ancient DNA specimens, specifically Y DNA haplotypes. What does that mean? Can you get down to one particular DNA haplotype, or are you really looking at source populations? So we're going to look at this, the genetic history of the Israelite nation. And this is from a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Creation. And Robert Carter, who deals with writings, a geneticist dealing with genetic writings, and he deals with this topic specifically. And you're going to catch a few surprises here. That in terms of what the current science is and what they're actually looking to do, it seems now the movement is not necessarily towards, in the religious community, it may be towards one particular genetic haplotype, but in the scientific, if you're just dealing with pure science, it tends to deal with population groups, ancient population groups. So when they go to these grave sites, when they get the DNA samples, what are they finding in known Jewish graveyards, grave sites from antiquity? Are they finding just one DNA haplotype, or are they finding multiple DNA haplotypes in known areas where Yehudim were buried? So we need to look at that and see if that matches Torah, if that matches the biblical record. Would you expect to see a diversity of Y DNA haplotypes, or would you expect to see only one Y DNA haplotype in various graveyards? And what does the biblical record say about that? So let's take a look at this right now, the genetic history of the Israelite nation. So I'll go past the first paragraph here, and I'll start with the Bible gives us a clear and detailed history. We'll start there, and I'll skip over a few parts because it's a lengthy article, but we'll hit on the main parts to kind of set up exactly this idea of, you had Israel start with a family, but where it started with the family was their diversity in terms of males, even where it started, right? And the idea that Abraham received the covenant, he received the covenant. Did he have other males who were under his authority who also had to get circumcised and who lived with him, who he took care of, who were directly under his authority? What would happen to them if they died in his care, right? So we have to look at all these things and see what is being said. So we'll start here. The Bible gives us a clear and detailed history of the Jewish nation. In fact, the biblical text may actually give us more detail. It may give us a more detailed ethnography for the Jews than we have in any other ancient nation. Detailed genealogical tables exist, and an unbroken history from Adam to Abraham and beyond is given to us with little to no ambiguity. But given that contemporary Jews descend from the biblical patriarch Jacob, how much of their genetics can be traced back to him? So this is the proposed question. With thousands of years of history that include migration, destruction, restoration, and a diaspora that has never ended, and much intermarriage with non-Jews, what should the state of their genetics be today? Okay, so he's not necessarily talking about an individual line from Abraham. He's talking about those who are religious Jews, a religious community. What would that look like? What should we expect that the genetics would look like? Ancient Jewish communities, most of which are still in existence, were founded in Africa, Algeria, for example, Libya, Morocco, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Southeast Africa, Asia, the Levant. He classifies Asia or the Levant in the Asia region, but we know that it does exist near or on the African tectonic plate. He talks about Asia Minor. He talks about Yemen, Baghdad, Iran, India, Burma, Europe, Spain, Italy, Central Europe, and possibly other places. So this is what his first acknowledgement is. He says some of these are more ancient, such as Yemen, than others, Ashkenazi, for example. Some were also founded by fewer people, Ethiopia, for example, but all of them claim descent from the Jews of ancient Israel. Some of these groups grew very large, but others remained quite small, causing significant levels of inbreeding over time. For example, the Northwest African colonies may have settled along Phoenician trade routes. They managed to hold on during centuries of conflict, but never managed to grow very large. Thus, high rates of endogamy exist in those small pockets, meaning that they basically married in their own family, so to speak, or in their own immediate family, cousins, second cousins, things like that. They did receive an influx of Sephardic Jews after Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Jews from Spain in 1492. But even today, one can see evidence for two groups in the genomes of those people. Modern genetics has advanced considerably over the past decade, with data from hundreds of thousands of individuals now available in public databases. We can draw historical inferences that would have been impossible just a short time ago. And statistical tools have been developed to take account of the overwhelming amount of data coming out of our sequencing machines. These tools allow us to see historical events in unprecedented detail. To that end, it is now possible to trace the ancestry of different sections of an individual's genome. There are some geographic areas where discriminating between two countries is difficult due to high levels of historical connectivity. France, Germany, for example. But there are other locations where ancestry is obvious due to the presence of unique and informative groups of genetic variants, such as areas in the Swiss Alps. And continental scale ancestry is easy to determine across most of the genome. Thus, it should be possible to determine an ancestral source population for modern Jews. So they're not necessarily, in this article, the target is not necessarily looking at one particular haplotype. It is looking whether or not you can find a source population for a community, and what did that look like in ancient times. This has nothing to do with evolution or the deep time assumption at the base of all evolutionary storytelling. That does not generally apply in this type of case here. Ancestry is a statistical question. How much and what parts of a person's genome can be localized geographically based on what we know about the distribution of his or her genetic variants in the contemporary human population? In short, it is now possible to definitively locate Y chromosomes, that's one, mitochondrial DNA lineages, and different stretches of autosomal DNA to specific geographic regions statistically. This does not have to be true. We did not know it was possible until after the data started to come in. But now that there are thousands of complete human genomes available, the case for geographical ancestry has become quite strong. Multiple questions arise when considering the Jewish people. Okay, so take note of this. Are there Jewish genes? Number one. Are the Jews a genetically distinct population? Can one trace the dispersed Jewish people back to their homeland in Israel? Is there any evidence that the 12 tribes of Israel came from a single family with a single patriarch? Questions like these are fascinating and can now be answered, but with multiple caveats. So he's setting this up. To get at these answers, we must first ask, what should we expect to find based on biblical history? We must then look at the genetic data and assess post-biblical history, which might include confounding factors, multiple outbreeding events with non-Jewish people, high levels of local endogamy, leading to strong genetic drift and founder effects. Even though the picture is complex, we would hope that these multiple sources of information will tell us the same thing. So let's jump right in. Y chromosomes. This is where the big conversation is, at least in the religious community. A direct paternal lineage from the patriarch Jacob is generally thought to define Jewishness. Now, remember, they're using Jewishness as equating to Israelite culture. So they're using that loosely to virtually mean the same thing or interchangeable here from the way they're writing. Yet early analysis with limited data concluded that more than one, now limited, take note of this, yet early analysis with limited data concluded that more than one Y chromosome haplotype exists among modern Jews. Does this contradict the biblical narrative? Actually, no. When comparing the Y chromosome haplotypes found in Jewish and non-Jewish Middle Easterners, it is clear that they share a common pool of sequences. The two together are distinct from non-Jewish groups in Europe, North Africa, and South Africa, but the majority of non-Middle Eastern Jews also trace back to a Middle Eastern Y chromosome source, meaning that all three groups come from the same paternal stock. Hammer et al., Dr. Hammer, who he had his research group et al., 2000 concluded that a major portion of the diversity of Jewish Y chromosomes, this is what his conclusion was, traced to a common Middle Eastern source population. Now notice the wording. He didn't say a single man. He's talking about a community, a community in the ancient times that had multiple people who some may have converted in, some may have came in at different times. It may have been admixture, secondary to war, you name it. But what he says here, that the current Jewish Y chromosomes trace back to a common Middle Eastern source population several thousand years ago. The implication is that this source population included a large number of distinct paternal and maternal lineages reflecting genetic variation established in the Middle East at the time. In turn, this source diversity has been maintained within Jewish communities despite numerous migrations during the diaspora and long-term residence as isolated subpopulation in numerous geographic locations outside of the Middle East. The multiplicity of distinct ancestral paternal lineages is due to the extensive mixing between Jews and non-Jews throughout their history, plus the possibility of founder effects at different places in Jewish history. In other words, it is possible, this is important to note, it is possible that a non-Jewish Y chromosome is found at higher than expected frequencies in specific Jewish populations today, simply because it happened to be represented in one of the men who founded a small colony. Okay. Among the Sephardic Jews, Y chromosomes from a diverse background can be found. The majority come from, take note, haplogroup J, strongly associated with Middle Eastern people. He's using very fine wording here. He's not saying it comes from Middle Eastern, but it's associated. Okay. Then he goes, but others are from E1B1A and E1B1B, common in Africa and other places. R1A, up to 30% seen in Ashkenazi men. R1B, most common lineage in Europe. Then he has Q, which is Asia, I, another part of Europe, and G, mainly Western Asia. So in the current Sephardic Jewish population, these are the haplotypes that come up the most common. This is interesting right here. The distribution of haplogroups found among the Spanish Sephardim was similar to a Jewish population in Turkey, sometimes included within the term Sephardim. This pattern also held for Jewish men from Northeast Portugal. Nearly 1/3 of the Y chromosomes were European. In that group were European R1b, common in Eastern Europe, and over half were Middle Eastern, 30% J, 16% T. Note that the Middle Eastern chromosomes come from diverse lineages. Thus, all Jewish men do not trace back to Jacob or Israel, and which lineage might represent him is a matter of debate. So he admits that honestly, that there's a debate. Was it J? Was it E1B1B? Is it E1B1A? This is a debate. See figure 1 for an explanation of these groups and how they are related to one another. I'll let you check that out on your own time. Continuing, there is some debate among biblical creationists as to where the root of the tree should be placed. But all of the people with whom I have discussed the subject to date agree that Y chromosome Noah should be somewhere near the center of the starburst pattern. The evolutionary root would be located about halfway along the A1 branch, but root placement has nothing to do with the relative relationship among the groups. The claims above were made on limited data. The studies often used only a few tandem repeats that have a high rate of back mutation, not fully sequenced chromosomes. This type of data is only useful for analyzing recent events. Re-examination of such data caused Taffanelli in 2014 to conclude that while one might be able to draw conclusions about the founding of various Jewish groups, the fact that multiple diverse lineages exist in these populations and that these lineages exist in non-Jewish groups as well highlights the lack of support for using them either as markers of Jewish ancestry or biblical tells. Yet these comments were premature. Further analysis of fully sequenced Y chromosomes indicate that the Ashkenazi individuals, for example, who carries the European Y chromosome of haplogroup R are not in fact related to the European branches in the Y chromosome family tree. Even though this family might be common in Europe, the Jewish version of it, right, basically were found to branch off earlier and to be more closely related to Middle Eastern men who carry haplogroup R. The clear implication is that, now this is very important to take note of, the clear implication is that this is an old pre-diaspora, possibly non-Jacob descent Y chromosome family, which is now found within the greater Jewish population. The majority of lines really do go back to a Middle Eastern setting. But we would expect them, but would we expect them to go back to a single person? In fact, no, we would not, based on the known history of the nation of Israel. Now he's going to approach the Y chromosome specifically, Aaron's Y chromosome. A surprising percentage of men across Judaism who claim to belong to the Levitical priesthood, the Kohanim, share a common Y chromosome within a subgroup of J. This is despite the fact that they have been separated in some cases for approximately 2,500 years. This Y chromosome type has been named the Cohen modal haplotype, and men who carry it are more closely related to each other than they are to other Jews in the community in which they live. The CMH is rare in non-Levitical Jews, is found in 50% of Levites, and occurs in a much higher proportion in the Kohanim. Hammer et al. In 2009 discovered that the Kohanim, this is very important to note, discovered that the Kohanim carry many different Y chromosome types, but most are at low frequencies. Okay, and this is a chart that showed you the different types, for example. And there are, so these are all the types that they carry. So, you know, this was discovered in 2009. You know, initially it was thought that it was mainly J, but on further sequencing, they found out, man, there's a lot of different types in those who claim Levitical ancestry. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind. This leads us to a fascinating anecdote that combines history, genetics, and oral tradition. The Lemba are a tribe from Southeast Africa with distinct customs and language. Their oral tradition claims they are Jewish, descendants of men involved in long-distance trade, but they are Bantu speakers and surrounded by Bantu-speaking peoples. Analysis of their Y chromosome revealed that more than half are of Middle Eastern origin. Mitochondrial DNA, however, reveals no evidence of West Asian roots. This is consistent with the tradition that they were descended from Jewish traders coming down the coast from the north. But the history is further confirmed by the fact that the Cohen modal haplotype is found within a certain subset of the Lemba, specifically in a particular family in the tribe. So not only did a group of Jewish men become marooned in southernmost Africa, and not only did they marry local women and settle down thousands of miles south of the equator and thousands of miles more from their ancestral homeland, but it appears that a descendant of Aaron or descendants of Aaron were among them. Yet the CMH has been disputed as of late, right? So in the literature, there's a dispute as to whether or not that J haplotype is really the Cohen haplotype. So that's in the literature, and he admits that. Specifically, since it is also found in non-Jewish populations, some argue that the occurrence of CMH is nothing more than a statistical anomaly. Of course, having Jewish Y chromosomes spread far and wide is expected based on biblical history, but the original studies were also performed on only a few Y chromosome markers. When the number of markers increased, check this out, it was learned that the Kohanim carry multiple unrelated Y chromosome types, several of which predominate. Due to the random nature of paternity in small populations, it is possible that the origin was lost or that introgression occurred, and a subsequent random fluctuation brought a new lineage to the fore. This may have been the case among the Samaritans of Israel. Their genealogy is restricted to 4 main families, but the Cohen family that claims the Samaritan priesthood carries haplotype E. In contrast, the other main Samaritan Y chromosome belong to haplotype J. Since it is conceivably possible that something similar could have occurred among Jews at some point in history, it is not possible. It is not possible to definitively state that the CMH is Aaron's Y chromosome. However, it is still likely, especially when one considers the fact that the men who carry it trace their tradition of being among the Kohanim to a time prior to the diaspora, which began before 500 BC. We'll skip over mitochondria DNA. I'll let you read that on your own. We're focusing mainly on the paternal Y DNA right now. But if we skip down to the genome-wide comparison, there's some really important facts that are kind of brought out here to help us in and just getting to the bottom of this. More detailed data sets have confirmed the conclusions of earlier studies, showing us that there exists among modern Jews a core set of genes and haplotypes that trace directly back to the Middle East. Also, significant sections of identity by descent and other measures indicate that the various Jewish populations are more closely related to each other than they are to outsiders, despite the fact that some of these groups have been separated from one another for millennia. When comparing the various Jewish groups to one another and to non-Jewish outgroups, interesting patterns emerge. For instance, since they started from a small group of Jewish settlers and interbred extensively with non-Jewish outsiders, the Ethiopian Jews unsurprisingly cluster with Ethiopians in genetic comparison, but they cluster with the Semitic-speaking Ethiopians, not the Cushitic-speaking Ethiopians. The Jews of Yemen, another old and isolated population, are more closely related to the Bedouins and Saudis than they are to the Yemenis. Indian Jews, like Ethiopian Jews, are closely related to their host population, indicating significant mixing over the years. But mixing can also be detected on larger scales. The following is based on evolutionary rates and dates, but it is an interesting conceptual framework that can help us to understand large-scale historical processes. The average Southern European has 1 to 3% African ancestry, most of which probably traces back to the Arab migrations after the fall of Rome. People from the region surrounding Israel carry 4 to 15% African ancestry, but these links probably trace back to more recent times, maybe 1,000 years ago. Multiple Jewish subpopulations also carry African DNA 3 to 5% with an estimated mixing rate of 70 generations ago. This is much older mixing than the other groups, going back more than 2,000 years. This means that African ancestry was almost certainly among them prior to diaspora. Yet even this is much later than the biblical date for the founding of Israel. It is only about halfway to Abraham. Genetic evidence being what it is, all we can say is that the Jews of the late Old Testament times already had a portion of African ancestry, or a small portion of at least a small portion of African ancestry. This may not turn up in Y chromosomes or mitochondrial studies due to genetic drift, whereas lineages tend to be lost and founder effects, but it has carried over to the rest of the genome. We'll skip over the disease portion. He talks about the disease portion. In certain clusters of Jewish societies or certain groups, you have a higher incidence of certain disorders, right? Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, for example, came on the scene, around 1492. That disease in and of itself is more like a type of a neurodegeneration disease. You almost think of it like a prion-associated disease, but it's not. But that tends to occur at a high rate in various Jewish populations. Something else to keep in mind with that is that, for example, in Jewish populations, there's a high rate of lactose intolerance, and it clusters in Jewish populations. You can also find that in what is known as so-called African-American populations, and in certain sets of Asian populations as well, too. You can also think of diseases like inflammatory bowel disease, right? Which would be Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. Those also tend to cluster in modern Jewish populations as well, too, right? And it's rarer in populations that are non-Jewish, so to speak. So that's just an example of what he talks about in the disease section. But you can read that one for yourself. We'll go to the alternative theories. We need to look at this Khazar hypothesis, right? So let's bite down into this and kind of see what the whole issue with the Khazar hypothesis is. So we need to look at this because this is something that, our author Kressler's book came out quite a while ago, and he talked about the idea of southern Turkey in that region, that the kingdom of the Khazars and mass conversion and what have you. So we got to look at this from a genetic standpoint and see what the scientific literature says about it. Is there an argument for? Is there an argument against? Let's look at that and see what both sides of the fence said concerning this, right? So once Need et al. Dr. Need discovered that one can statistically separate people with Jewish ancestry from the general population of Europeans, the race to discover Jewish genes was on. Even though there are clear patterns, the idea that there are exclusive Jewish genes was recently contradicted by Elhaik. So Dr. Elhaik is a Israeli geneticist, and he's shown up. I've seen a couple of his videos with brothers who are in the Israelite community. Very good interviews that were done by him. I think we have a couple of links in our notes below that you can go check out some of the conversation with those. Very good interviews that two brothers did concerning that, and that would be beneficial for you to look at. I think We Woke Now, that brother did excellent work with an interview concerning him, and also with Boom Church. Excellent interviews with him, so you can look those up on YouTube. But even in his writings and his research papers, he deals with this Khazar hypothesis. So he has 6 main points to his argument, right? 6 main points. And we're going to see if Dr. Carter is going to disagree with those points. And, so we can get a balance in terms of what the literature says with this. And even if there is an issue there, does it matter when you look at Torah and following the Most High, right? So let's take a look at this. So Dr. Elhaik contradicted this concept, right? He has 6 major points, all of which, in Dr. Carter's view, are questionable. So he reinstates them here. So number 1, Dr. Elhaik, his first support of this Khazar hypothesis, number 1, it is unlikely that an Israelite gene ever existed since Iron Age Israelite tribes exchanged genes with their neighboring tribes. So he doesn't think a specific gene that you can call just a specific Israelite gene exists. Iron Age would be, after Father Abraham received the covenant from Yah, and you have the development of the tribes, right? And now you have full tribes, and they're exchanging, interacting with tribes of the land there in Canaan. So number 2, had there been a paternal Israelite gene, right? And we're talking about source populations, right? Had there been a paternal Israelite gene on the Y chromosome, it would have been lost due to the transition to matrilineal descent, right? So there's an argument in the religious literature as to when matrilineal descent started. Did it happen at Sinai? There's some evidence that, at least from the traditional Orthodox perspective, they might say it's Sinai, but from a biblical, more Western perspective, it really is no case for matrilineal descent when you look at Torah. So that's one issue there. His next point is that had there been a maternal Israelite gene on the mitochondrial chromosome, it would have been lost due to the initial period of patrilineal descent. Had there been, number 4, had there been an autosomal Israelite gene, it would have been lost due to high rates of movement into the religion. Number 5, had there been an autosomal Israelite gene, it would not be unique to Jews due to the high rate of movement out of the religion. Number 6, had there been an autosomal Israelite gene that survived to modern day, it would have been extremely rare and undetectable by popular search approaches that put a priority on finding genes that are common to a large fraction of Jews, right? So when they do these studies for genetics, they tend to look at characteristics that are very common as opposed to very rare characteristics there genetically. So his rebuttal, point 1 through 4, depends on the degree of mixing with other populations plus chance. Being that the Jews have always had a certain degree of separation from other cultures, the assumption would be that they may have maintained some genetic distinction. Point 5 is so basically he said it really did, for his rebuttal to El-Hake, he basically says, it really depends on the degree of mixing. Did they really mix that much, considering their set apart nature? Number 5, he agrees with him on number 5. He said this is given and is well attested to in the literature. This is one of the main reasons why there are no Jewish genes. And we're talking in terms of having specific genes in a source population. This is what he's referring to, not necessarily an individual man, right? But this still does not mean that there are no genetic Jews. We may not be able to positively identify a Jew by their genes, but one does find genes common to Jews found throughout their current distribution. And that's why the little section on disease was important, because you can find clusters of certain genetic diseases, so to speak, that are very high among the Jewish population. And he continues on here. He says his final point 6 depends on the status of his Khazar hypothesis. El-Hake has attempted to claim Eastern European Jews were descended from the Turkish Khazars of Central West Asia. This seems to be a resurrection of the controversial ideas of Kosler. But this theory was quickly attacked or shot down by others in the literature. Specifically, it seems that his team's use of the Georgian Jews as a proxy for the assumed genotype of someone from the now vanished kingdom of Khazars was a mistake. For the Georgians are not only south of the Caucasus Mountains, but they cluster tightly with the Middle Eastern Jews in genetic analysis. So this is his rebuttal of that point 6. Instead of being evidence for a mass conversion of Jews in ancient times, the data instead shows that the Ashkenazi Jews are related to those in the Middle East. Okay. El-Hake's team has also attempted to claim that Yiddish does not originate in Germany, but northeastern Turkey along the Silk Road. This was also controversial, and both methods and conclusions were strongly contradicted in print. So basically, you have an argument in the literature, in the scientific literature, going back and forth on this issue. And so Dr. Carter says essentially this: hey, I will leave it up to you to go search this out in more detail. There's some tit for tat going on in the literature, but he's against El-Hake's view. He does not think that his view is solid. So he says this specifically: I do happen to agree with one of his conclusions, that Jewishness is more of a religious and or social construct than it is a biological reality. But I come to these points through very different means, and I reject entirely his criteria. Plus, I cannot discount the multiple strands of genetic and historical evidence linking them to the biblical Jews. Ashkenazi and Sephardic populations have less than 40% European ancestry and are more similar to each other than they are to Europeans in general. So even though there has been a significant amount of inbreeding among Jews and Europeans. The Khazar hypothesis, in his opinion, is incorrect. Okay, so you can look down in the references for this. There's a good back and forth going on this, and you can see where you are in support of this or against it. But we just wanted to present the information to you on both sides of the fence. The lost tribes of Israel. Essentially, there is zero attestation to the claims of the Book of Mormon, to the claims the Book of Mormon makes regarding Native American ancestry. Instead of descending from the lost tribes of Israel, which were never lost, the genetic evidence puts Native Americans squarely into Northeast Asian genetic landscape. The minor contribution of Judaism we find in the Spanish-speaking populations of South and Central America come from the cryptic Sephardums of Spain and Portugal, who, in his opinion, he believes merged into those populations as opposed to those populations independently being from Israel. Another alternative theory is the claim that the British population descends from the lost tribes of Israel. He also does not agree with this position. Genetically, he says this is 100% false. Likewise, the idea of the Picts of ancient Scotland descend from a Jewish group is false. I won't take more time on these subjects, but he does give you a reference to go for you to check out and see if you agree, yay or nay. The conclusion, in his opinion, there is no Jewish gene. Although there are certainly genes common to Jews, and because of the possibility of genetic drift, we cannot be 100% certain that things like the CMH are actually the Y chromosome of Aaron. However, Jews today absolutely fit both the biblical expectation and their oral and written history since the completion of the Old Testament canon. From the detailed history of the Jewish nation preserved in the biblical narrative, it should be clear that they started as a mixed population, maintained a degree of mixing with their neighbors, and continue to mix with outsiders today. However, as a Mid-Eastern tribal community, they should have Middle Eastern genetic roots, and the evidence tells us they certainly do. What does this tell us about race in general? Sklatkin and Racimo say it this way in 2016. We now know that present-day populations were created by a complex history of admixture and population movement. Although local genetic continuity over long periods has been documented in few cases, these are exceptional. The general rule is that the ancestors of present-day populations lived somewhere else. So now we know that human history is complex and sometimes convoluted. The various people groups on this planet all have the telltale sign of their ancestors mixed with other people. The Jewish people, due to their rich historical background, serve as a test case that informs us what we would expect to find in other groups. Essentially, every people group should represent a history of mixing that unites us all under one common banner: descendants of Adam and relatives of Jesus Christ, the kinsman redeemer. So that's a pretty lengthy article. We try to cut out some parts of it. The important part, from my view, that I got from this is that in the scientific literature, it seems that the target is to find source ancient populations and compare them with modern day population. Sometimes we can get very narrow, but when you look at Torah, we certainly know that people came in at different points. There are multiple texts. You can look at Ezekiel 47:22, Esther 8, Esther chapter 8, 1 King 8:41, Isaiah 56:3, Deuteronomy 23:7. When you look at all these together, it shows you a pattern, almost like a type of immigration policy, that the Torah did have this type of policy that if a stranger came to seek after Yehuda, to keep his law, statutes, and commandments, there was a process or an immigration policy for that person to be able to come in to be part of Kol Israel. So we see that clearly in the biblical text, and it seems, from at least from this research paper, that the genetics may very well support that to an aspect. The only critique I have on this article is that he dealt with, he certainly dealt with, populations where the culture originated. If you look at where the culture was dispersed to, then you would also have to deal with issues with the Americas and West Africa as well, where you have the Bantu tribes, where you do have quite a bit of what you might call Hebrewisms and, frankly, Hebraic historical record. So I think that in Europe as well. So you have to be very careful with the absolutes, the 100% that he listed there for certain populations. So very good article. The jewel of this article is the references at the bottom. He has a ton of on his reference page other research articles that you can go dig into and check out for your own viewing pleasure.
Agreed very much with you on the statement regarding his 100% statements that I find it interesting that the vast majority of genetic research also is all about what we see today as the visible piece of the modern Jews, without an understanding that, all the way 2,750 years ago now, plus or minus, is when the house of Israel was dispersed and scattered and sent all kinds of different places and what have you. And so there's a significant mixing that happened on that side of the family that I don't think, if it has been researched, as Dr. Murray seems to indicate in her recent comment here, I'll throw it back up here. The fact is if that research has been done, it's very closely guarded and taken care of, because there's reason not to acknowledge the fact that there are 10 other tribes out there beyond the house of Judah that was Benjamin, Judah, and part of Levi, some of the Kohanim. So
the other thing I find fascinating is that they seem to have been surprised when they checked out the ancient samples and they found J's traveling along with E's, both branches of the E's, E1, B1A, E1, B1B, and R's and Q's and I's. So they found in these ancient samples, like, whoa, and I think that was one of El Hike's points, was that, when, initially when they started doing this research in the early 2000s, late 1990s, they were, the sequences were very few. And then as it began to open up and they actually didn't have ancient samples, they were just comparing modern day groups to modern day groups. They weren't actually going back and looking at the old grave sites, the old graveyards, looking at these old communities. And once they started doing that, and the excavation and looking at the archaeology and finding the old bones, so to speak, then they basically found a diversity within even just the Y paternal haplotype that was quite shocking. So I think that that's certainly interesting when you look at the integration policies that you find in Torah, for lack of a better term. Yeah.
Amen. All right, so let's see here. We have got, let's see here. Let's start with a real quick clip here. I need to share this first because clip happens so fast. I need to make sure that I've got it. See.
Popular with locals and tourists, this market has over 250 vendors selling all sorts of fruits, vegetables, baked goods, and a variety of local street food. This is Mahane Yehuda Market in Jerusalem. Popular with locals and tourists, this market has over 250 vendors selling all sorts of fruits, vegetables, baked goods, and a variety of local street food.
And I have to say that Mahane Yehuda is a great place to go and get a really good picture of the diversity within Israel. That's now I've been blessed to be able to go to Israel 8 different times, and every single time we make it a point to go down to the Shuk on Mahane Yehuda, and that was obviously filmed on a Yom Rishon. It was a Sunday morning or something when nobody's there. Because if you go on the Rev Shabbat Friday afternoon up until about 3 o'clock when the shuk closes, the place is a madhouse. It is wall to wall people, and they're going to rub more than elbows. It's unbelievably rich too in the diversity of foods, diversity of cultures that are there that all would claim the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and many who understand and know and recognize the Mashiach. But it's a rich place. The picture that we had right there of all the different fruits and stuff laid out, it's the same way. And within Israel, it's amazing to me that every time we go, we experience a broad diversity, a real tapestry of peoples that come from all over the world that are in modern vernacular Jews. And that's just that part of the house. It's not even looking at the house of Israel and where we return from. But they come from all over. And interestingly, within Israel, there's not this big discussion over who is and who isn't. Within Israel, a broad diversity in color and returning cultures and backgrounds and all of that sort of stuff is just expected as part of the experience of being a formerly exiled people. So let's move on to the next article. I think it's my turn. And I'm going to pull this up right quick. Make sure I have the right one here. And do a quick share. So looking here at the diaspora community, throughout their history, Jews have been forced to flee from their homelands into galut or exile, creating distinct and prominent communities in Babylonia, Germany, Iberia, etc. Diaspora or dispersion created Jewish communities such as the Ashkenazi, the Sephardi, the Mizrahi, all these different communities, all different parts of that part of the world. Communities are still recognizable far afield and centuries after their creation, even in the United States. And again, going back to language and language being important, understand, we talk about Jews. This is the house of Judah. It's not taking into account those that left Israel 150 years prior to their Babylonian exile and never returned. So this is just looking at one part of the larger family of Kol Israel. Galut is the Hebrew word for exile and refers to the repeated exile of the Jewish people from their homeland in Israel. And I would say not just the Jewish people, but Israel, right? The northern kingdom as well. Some Jews have chosen to live outside Israel for centuries. In ancient times, they formed communities in the Near East and eventually around the Mediterranean. But the Jewish community has also been divided into exile by force, notably to Babylonia, first after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, and later in a far more devastating move after the Romans' near total destruction of Judea in 135 CE. Exile in Babylonia gave rise to the first permanent Jewish community outside of Israel. Even after periods of restoration, most Jews chose to remain behind in having obeyed the instructions of the prophet Yirmiyah, who advised the exiled community to build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit, take wives, beget sons and daughters, and seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to Yah on your behalf. Jeremiah 29:5. Refusing to dwell upon their homelessness, the Jewish exiles adopted a novel attitude. They assimilated into the culture in which they found themselves while maintaining their separate identity as Jews and their adherence to Jewish tradition and culture. This interwoven pattern of assimilation and separatism would persist throughout the history of the diaspora, a Greek term coined specifically for the dispersion of Jews throughout the Hellenistic Greek-speaking world. Following the Hellenistic conquest of Palestine in 323 BCE, Jews flocked to Ptolemaic Egypt, especially the city of Alexandria, where a flourishing community would produce the Septuagint, or the Torah translated into Greek. The Alexandrian Jewish philosopher Philo, 25 BCE to 40 CE, famously brought together much of Hellenistic and Jewish thought, lending a good deal of influence to Western theology and philosophy. By 70 CE, following the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, Jewish communities could be found throughout the civilized world. It's estimated that they constituted as much as 10% of the Roman Empire and up to 20% of its eastern half. Major Jewish communities existed in Rome, Antioch, Syria, Ephesus in Turkey, and Sardis in Asia Minor. Living in such widespread locales, Jews entered numerous occupations, including farming and horse breeding, crafts and manufacturing, business and trade, civil administration, and military. After the final defeat of Israel at the hands of the Romans in 135 CE, the pace of immigration from Israel quickened, and Jews continued to establish new communities even further afield. Interesting too, if you do a lot of research in this, a lot of those communities that the Jews in the diaspora were establishing actually connected with a lot of the House of Israel that had left centuries earlier and established their own small communities, and so a lot of those places got mixed together along the way as well. The communal structure of the early diaspora set the pattern for later Jewish communities elsewhere in the world. Within sovereign states, larger Jewish communities often had their own internal administration. In Poland, for example, Jewish communities were governed by a quasi-autonomous body called the Kehila, the community. Within sovereign cities, the Jewish community was often assigned a separate status and occupied a special quarter. Hence, the Jews of North Africa developed the communal district called Mela, where the Jews of Central Europe were compelled to live in a confined area called a ghetto, so named after the first of its kind in 16th century Venice. Still later, the Jews of Eastern Europe created a new form of community, predominantly Jewish town, called a shtetl. Echoes of these diverse communal forms may be seen today in the nationwide Jewish socio-political organizations and in local ethnic neighborhoods of American and, more broadly, Western Jewry. Now, I could take a hard right turn here and talk about the needs for us to be reverse engineering this for the restoration of our people and come together in similar places or communities, that kind of thing. With individual property ownership, I would refer everybody back to what we did regarding inheritance and Torah rights about 6 weeks ago or something on this same live stream with this same group of men, and how that relates to us as men being patriarchs and taking care of our families. The communal expansion of the diaspora also served to fragment world Jewry. Living apart in diverse regions over many centuries, Jews have taken on a multiplicity of cultural and even racial characteristics. Today, the most critical distinction is that between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazi, representing the two most historically significant communities. During the Middle Ages, the largest Jewish community in the world was in Spain under Muslim rule, arguably a golden age of Jewish life and freedom. This flourishing Jewish community was referred to by the Hebrew name for Spain, Sepharad. At the same time, the Jewish communities of France and Germany were developing a distinct culture of their own in a community known as the Hebrew name for Germany, Ashkenaz. Following the Christian conquest of Spain and the ultimate expulsion of its Jews in 1492, Sephardic exiles spread throughout the port cities of the Mediterranean, Palestine, and Northern Europe. In this new Sephardic diaspora, Jews often came into contact with their Ashkenazi counterparts, also victims of expulsions and other forms of persecution. Both groups maintained their own communities, strengthening their separate communal identities. Language was a key factor in creating the separation. Sephardic Jews preserved their culture in the Judeo-Spanish language of Ladino, while Ashkenazi Jews remained loyal to Judeo-German or Yiddish. The split between the Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews has only begun to be blended in the melting pot of modern Israel, where Jews of various culture and linguistic groups have begun to merge into one Israeli Jewish society. The establishment of modern Israel has ended nearly 2,000 years of Jewish exile and genocide, although not without controversy of its own. The experience of exile came to characterize the spiritual sensibility of the Jewish people in diaspora. The concept of being outcast and marginalized, of expulsion and wandering, came to be seen as an intrinsic part of Jewish existence. This close association with the less fortunate and marginalized has motivated many modern Jews to support causes that work towards social justice, both within and without the Jewish community. At times in Jewish history, the theme of interminable suffering has also seemed to pervade all aspects of Jewish life, but life in the diaspora has also encouraged a rich variety of Jewish food, music, folk customs, as well as positive energy and vision of Jewish religious culture. Life in the diaspora has highlighted the Jewish belief in an eventual return to the homeland of Zion. The worldwide interconnectedness of the Jewish people, the strength of the Jewish family and community life, the sustenance of studying Torah and observing mitzvot, and perhaps more than any of the above, the belief that God has watched over the Jews and will ultimately redeem them from their long exile. One point that I would make, a saying that is fairly common within Judaism, there was some mention here of tradition and culture. And it's common among Jews to hear that the Shabbat, it hasn't been so much that the Jews have kept Shabbat, but the Shabbat has kept the Jews because they're bound together by being set apart, doing something different than what the rest of the world does. And that speaks to how important it is for us to adhere to and walk in the commandments, because that makes us recognizable to our brothers, based on the fact that we're keeping the commandments and walking according to the way the Most High desires. So a lot of good stuff right there.
Amen.
So what, let's see. We have got another video. Any other comments on that before we move forward?
Yeah, I appreciated the detail of the history. There's a lot of things that are not just as simple as, okay, they just went to Europe. But when you actually look at the things that happened and, the way the communities had to form and the stresses and things that were going on is not as clear cut. They had to interact with each other and the surrounding people in ways that actually helped them in terms of surviving. So I really appreciated the detail of that in terms of just giving you a historical setting, because a lot of that material you have to dig deep for. And so yeah, that I really appreciated that. That gives me a new appreciation of that branch of the family, so to speak. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it also helps to filter. No, I just was going to say, it also helps to filter through a lot of the bias information that we've been inundated with,
right.
as we, are able to receive this information that, just sheds light. Yeah.
So let's take a look now at some of the Asian branch of Jewish and Israelite diaspora, and you notice now we're working our way around multiple continents, and we're going to get ultimately to Africa. The African branch is next, but we're going to take a quick look into Asia. We're going to start with another short video here that gives us a look at or some foundational stuff for Asia, and then Brother Jeremy Guiton will present an article for us. So here we go. I think I've got the audio on.
While most of Jewish history is too often simplified to a series of migrations solely driven by persecutions and anti-Semitism, that is far from the whole story. Trade has been just as much of a driving force. And to understand how significant Jewish communities ended up in countries like China and India, you first need to understand the powerful impact that trade has played, time and time again, in shaping the path of the Jewish people. The first Jews to visit China were traders traveling from these regions, and even Western Europe as early as the 8th century. But it wasn't until the early 12th century when a Persian-speaking Jewish community settled in Kaifeng, building a synagogue there in 1163. Although it was not the only Chinese city to establish a Jewish community during this time, Kaifeng was the most important and longest lasting, being a major terminus on the Silk Road. While Jews were only one of many groups using trade between China and the West, the vast network of Jewish traders enabled communication from the Pacific all the way back to the Atlantic, which helped keep the global Jewish community in touch. Because of this, Kaifeng Jews managed to maintain continuous contact with goings-on in the rest of the Jewish world, particularly the writings of Maimonides, who had begun his career in Egypt right around the time Kaifeng's synagogue was built. This continued through the glory years of the Mongol Empire. Under the Ming Dynasty, Kaifeng Jews reached their peak of about 5,000 people, participating actively in the military and the highly selective civil administration. They were recognized by the government as both a distinct ethnic community and as non-barbarian Chinese subjects. However, with the onset of the Age of Exploration, the community began to decline. In Europe, the development of ships that were large and fast enough to cross entire oceans made it cheaper and more efficient to reach China by sea than by land. That, combined with the Little Ice Age, which caused desertification and depopulation in Central Asia, all but ended the importance of the Silk Road. Back in Kaifeng, the synagogue was devastated by a series of floods, with the worst being in 1642. Without a connection to the wider Jewish world, the synagogue's library could no longer be replaced, worsening an ongoing decline in Jewish education. This led to greater assimilation, and by the dawn of the 20th century, fewer than 300 Kaifeng Jews remained. United mainly by the vague awareness of their Jewish heritage, they most especially abstained from eating pork, wore a localized form of the kippah, and refrained from work on the Sabbath. In the words of Sir Martin Gilbert, despite 8 centuries of Chinese influence, the Jews still retained the vestiges of their origins and were recognizably Jewish. But by the mid-19th century, their Jewishness and their knowledge of Judaism had almost entirely vanished. Despite various attempts since the 1850s to revitalize connections between Kaifeng and the wider Jewish world, the government of China has made it difficult. In the 1950s, the Chinese Communist Party refused to recognize Jews as an official minority group, and it prohibited overt displays of Kaifeng's Jewish heritage. Today, the community numbers around 1,000 members, and the struggle to obtain recognition and reunite with world Jewry remains difficult. Kaifeng was just one of many Jewish communities in the region, each with their own origins and history. In India, 2 of the biggest were the Cochin Jews and B'nai Israel. Some historians believe that Jews began living in India as far back as the 1st century CE. They first arrived there as traders via the Roman Indian trade system, which brought Jewish communities to Arabia. Scattered along the Malabar coast, these Cochin Jews maintained close ties with Jewish communities to the west and were allowed to live freely by the local rulers, who, as Hindu polytheists, tended not to view foreign religions as a threat to their own. After all, what's one more god on top of an entire pantheon? According to tradition, an additional group of Jewish traders were shipwrecked on the coast of Maharashtra and ultimately settled there, where they became known as the B'nai Israel. Their relative isolation caused their religious practices to drift. Only beginning in the 16th century did they re-engage with the wider Jewish world. Centuries later, during the early modern period, crypto-Jewish traders from Portugal began fleeing to India, mostly living alongside the Cochinim. These were Jews who had been forced by the Portuguese government to conceal their Judaism. The earlier waves of migration created from trade made the region safe for those fleeing persecution in Portuguese-controlled ports. By the 19th century, Jews fleeing the rebel government in Ottoman Iraq settled in cities like Bombay and Calcutta, later spreading to many other corners of the world. Following the independence of both India and Israel from British colonial control in the 1940s, most of India's 25,000 Jews steadily made Aliyah to Israel. This was not the result of any persecution, however. In many Jewish communities of Asia, an attachment to the Jewish homeland was much stronger ideologically than it was in Europe. The love of Israel had remained strong, and the opportunity to come back to the Jewish homeland after the long exile was seized by almost the entire community. Honestly, this only scratches the surface of Jewish life in India and China. Both countries have been joined by new Jewish arrivals in the 20th and 21st centuries, which continue to shape the life and history of both those countries and of Judaism itself. This is something that can be said about all Jewish communities in diaspora, but it's worth remembering that they are far more widespread and diverse than we often realize.
My turn.
Brother Peter, I think your mic is muted. We can't hear you.
Brother Pete, we still can't hear you.
Your mic is muted, Brother Pete.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Try that one more time. No, I thought I had Jeremy's article up here, and somehow it wasn't open on my desktop as all of these others have been, and so I was scrambling. All right, sir.
All right. Let's dive right in here. The Jews of India. The history of Judaism from ancient times has been entangled with the experiences of the Jewish diaspora. The first exodus of the Jewish people from Mizraim to the land of Israel has further strengthened the idea that the Jews will be delivered back to the promised land by God if they follow his commandments and keep the covenant. Since the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians and the forcible expulsion requiring the Jews to move to Babylon, the Jewish community increased its reliance on the written text, Torah, around 538 BC, not completely written down until 586 BC. The ability of the Jewish people to be able to live in different cultures and nations and still keep their Jewish identity intact, even after assuming certain cultural characteristics from the Gentiles, makes the study of the Jewish people even more fascinating. The establishment of the state of Israel marked an end to the history of the Jews existing as a nation without a state, to them finally able to move over to the land of Israel and live on the promised land. The study of the Jewish diaspora generally revolves around the experiences of the Ashkenazi Jews with origins in Europe and Sephardic Jews originating in the Middle East. The study of the Jewish diaspora in India is a neglected subject, particularly due to their small numbers. The existence of a common link between Abrahamic faiths have led to the Jewish ideas and concepts play an important role in the development of both Islam and Christianity. These predefined notions and ideas have led to the development of a love-hate relationship between the Jewish people living in the Middle East and Europe. The history of the Jewish diaspora in India can be said to be uncommon due to a special relationship of respect, tolerance, and coexistence emerging from the interaction between India's Hindu civilization and the Judaic civilization. This paper is going to gloss over this relationship with a focus on the different kinds of Jewish communities in India, their arrival, culture, acculturation practices, and finally their migration to Israel after the 1950s. The Jewish people in India are divided into different groups, tracing their arrival to India from different theories. The three main communities of Jews in India are the Cochinins, the Bnei Israel, and the Bagadadis. The Cochin Jews claim their ancestry to Jerusalem, fleeing the Roman invasion and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. The Bnei Israel based their arrival into India on a story describing a shipwreck on the coast of the Indian state of Maharashtra, carrying the ancestors of the Bnei Israel. And the Bagadi Jews is often the term used in India for Jews migrating from Arabic and Persian-speaking regions. Regardless of them having origin in Baghdad, before elaborating further on the different Jewish communities of India, it is important to point out that the Indian Jewish diaspora is unique to the point that historically there have been no traces of anti-Semitism found in India. I would think that I'm just thinking of there is a significant Islam population in India. I would imagine there's some anti-Semitism coming from that. But anyway, continuing on. The Bnei Israel were the largest Jewish community in India, found in the Indian state of Maharashtra. As per existing legends, a ship carrying their ancestors wrecked near the coast of Maharashtra, leaving behind 7 families. They swam to a village known as Navgaon and settled there. With the passage of time, they forgot their traditions and Hebrew, thereby adopting local customs. Their customs, such as avoiding work on Saturday, separated them from the other Indian communities. Not having any such restrictions, they took to the profession of oil pressers, which resulted in them being known as Shaniwar Talis, Saturday oil pressers. They referred to themselves as Bnei Israelis rather than Jews for the most part of their history. It is believed by them that they had lost their Jewish identity until the arrival of a Jewish scholar from the Middle East to India in the 10th century, essentially teaching them the Torah and Jewish religious customs. As the Bnei Israelis started asserting their religious traditions around the 18th century, association with other Jewish communities became more common. The Bnei Israel have several customs that make them distinct from other Indian Jews. One of these is known as Malida, where the men sit around a plate containing rice, fruit, flowers, spices, singing praises to God. They abstain from eating beef, probably in respect for the majority Hindu community's belief. Another Bnei Israel custom traceable to Hindu influences was refraining from widow remarriage. The B'nai Israel were not very particular about maintaining kosher law as compared to other Jewish communities of India, pointing towards a loss of Jewish customs from being ensconced away from mainstream Jewry. The B'nai Israel community has a history of fighting in the military of the Maratha hero Shiva, but their rise to prominence was typically during the English rule of the Indian subcontinent. Many of them fought for the British in various ways, resulting in the British giving them special preferences. In later periods, they achieved high levels of education and served the British as well as the subsequent Indian governments as government officials, professors, and soldiers. Some of them were able to reach high-ranking positions in modern India. The B'nai Israel population at its peak was about 30,000 during the 1950s, with many of them having migrated to Israel and other Western countries. Their population in India is approximately 5,000, mostly older people, living around the suburb of Mumbai. This article probably goes into a few details that are not necessarily germane to our discussion, but let me keep going here.
You can feel free to skip forward if you need to.
Yeah, I only realized right before we started the live stream that this was my article. I actually was mistaken and thinking it was another one, so I had done more prep work on that other one. So, the Kochini Jews were one of the first Jewish communities of India living in southern India, state of Kerala. The available evidence points out that the Cochin Jews arrived in India during different phases rather than a single immigration. There are various theories about the origin of the Cochin Jews, ranging from them coming to India as traders during King Solomon's time, being related to one of the 10 lost tribes, or escaping persecution after the destruction of the Second Temple. The presence of distinctly Indian goods such as peacocks and spices during King Solomon's time reinforced the existence of a trade relationship between the ancient Israelis and Indians. It is possible that the existence of a Jewish settlement in South India was known to other Jews due to the arrival of additional Jewish immigrants at later stages. I'm going to skip over that one and move. I'm just going to kind of read the first paragraph of each here. Bagadi Jews arrived in India primarily during the 18th century from Middle Eastern countries. As the name suggests, most of the Baghdadi Jews arrived in India from Baghdad, but a large number of them arrived from other Arabic and Persian-speaking countries. The Baghdadi Jews came to India for a combination of reasons that includes escaping from religious persecution and better business prospects. Their communities were generally concentrated in major Indian commercial centers during the time, such as Mumbai, Calcutta, and Surat, along with Rangoon, which was then part of British India. They were mainly in the textile business, and some of them were able to achieve considerable success as businessmen. A famous Baghdadi Jewish family were in the Sassons, famous for their philanthropic activities such as building hospitals, schools, and libraries. The Baghdadi Jews were relatively powerful due to their influence on the Indian economy. Many of them adopted English language and culture and immigrated to England. They tended to keep themselves separate from other Jewish communities in India, turning more accepting of other Indian Jewish communities during the mid-20th century. and embracing a nostalgic Indian identity after moving out of India. The recent coming to light of some tribal groups in northeastern states of India having Jewish customs and attempts by certain Jewish organizations like Amishav to connect them to the practice of Judaism has created complications to the question of Jewish identity. These tribes inhabit the Indian states of Manipur, Mizoram, Assam, and Nagaland, along with regions of Burma and Bangladesh. Tracing their origin from tribes entering India from China, they claim ancestry from the tribe of Manasseh. The official stand of Israel of refusing to identify them as Jewish, thereby refusing them entry into Israel, has created a controversy propagated by their inability to provide proof of their lineage, leading to further complications. In addition to the above-mentioned groups, there are scattered traces in India of several other Jewish groups that came to India throughout the ages. Portuguese Maranhãos are the Jews that accompanied the Portuguese ships traveling to India for trade. 2,000 Ashkenazi Jews were housed in India as temporary refugees escaping from Nazi Germany, some of whom stayed in India. I'm going to skip over some of this here. My apologies for not being as prepared on this particular article as I would have liked to have been. I'm going to skip down to that last paragraph. The en masse migration to Israel has devastated the state of India Jewry. Few Jews remain in India, most of whom are older people not wanting to leave the country of their birth due to the inability to adapt to a foreign Western culture in Israel. Younger people have left for a multitude of reasons, ranging from the desire to move back to the land of Israel to the hopes of finding a better future. The minuscule population of Jews in a heavily populated independent India put the Indian Jews in a precarious situation. On one hand, there was a strong pull to be finally able to move back to the Jewish state of Israel. On the other hand, Indian politics intermingled with caste as well as religion might result in them in a vulnerable position as a minority. The pro-Arab stance of secular Indian parties in relation to Palestine and the Arab world, particularly due to the large Muslim presence, further complicated the issue. A point to note is that the rise of nationalist Hindu fundamentalism as a response to Islamic expansionism leads to both the Jews and the Hindutva groups to sympathize and form alliances with each other. Finally, with the end of Indian Jewry in the near future, it is important to rescue the wealth of the Indian Jewish culture in the forms of various manuscripts, paintings, artifacts, hymns, and poems before they are completely lost.
One of the connections to this article, I have had the chance a couple times on my trips to Israel. I've had a chance to meet with Rabbi Harry Rosenberg, who ironically is from New York. He owns the 12 Tribes Brewery in New York that actually makes a mead recipe where the recipe for the mead originally comes from Ethiopia. But his passion is trying to track down all the different strands of the family, particularly the Northern Kingdom. And so he has traveled, I think, into Afghanistan and into Pakistan and northern India and all these regions where there's B'nai Manasseh, B'nai Ephraim, B'nai Israel, and other groups that are connected either to Jewry or have longstanding traditions that indicate that they came out of the house of Israel sometime much earlier and traveled as a group somewhere, or groups that collected and became, settlers and then their own independent populations in those parts of the world. Indicating again just this migration in all different directions and these circumstances up into Central Asia and into India.
Yeah, a couple of the different things I found interesting here was the speaking about the trade relationship that was likely present during Solomon's time and all of that. I thought that was quite interesting and again, obviously that's way pre-exile as far as when folks would have landed there.
I'm of the strong opinion that he had a fleet that sailed the globe. I think that that there are indications. For example, the Los Alamos stone in southwestern United States is supposed to be somewhere around 3,000 years old, which probably dates to. And one of our commenters that we'll have in the hot takes here in a little bit, who is a Native American, can probably speak to that a little bit in terms of the Los Alamos stone, that where in Paleo Hebrew, if I'm not mistaken, the 10 Commandments are written, and this is in New Mexico. How does that get there 3,000 years ago? Right.
That
kind of thing.
Yeah,
So that
absolutely.
would have been at the time of Shlomo, and global exploration and these sorts of things. Other comments while I move us on to the next one? We're going to head into the African branch in a little bit. And Brother Jan, I'm looking at the clock. I'm looking at what we've got left on the agenda. I'm thinking that what we'll do is go through this segment here with Brother Mike's article, and then maybe push stuff forward to the next one so we can get the hot takes going.
Absolutely. Sounds good. Mm-hmm.
All right. So any other comments y'all have up to this point?
This information alone, it's really showing not only how scattered Israel is, but also how widespread the talents are of Israel throughout the generations. Not just from Solomon's trade, but also from what Brother Jeremy just read, all the things that they were doing in India, and even the video that you played, things that they were doing in Asia. On the surface, being somebody of the world, you wouldn't think that the Jews had this much reach, especially throughout history, basically all over the world. Mm-hmm. And even today that they're still out there. So good stuff, guys.
This right here, I've got to tell you, I just love this. As a soldier, this completely motivates me, but it's also a classic picture. This was a clip that I saw that I sent to Brother Jan. It's a classic example of the brotherhood that is in Israel that doesn't see this skin tone issue thing that is so often prevalent out here in the diaspora, with everybody is sort of kind of pushing for a corner of the market. Enjoy this. This just, I get motivated every time I see this. That just gets me jacked up.
Yeah, talk about getting pumped up, getting that morale.
Right.
Yeah, love that. All right. Well, my article is "Are Jews Black?" All right, and this is written by Tudor Parfit. It's written during a Black History Month, and so written and was presented in February the 17th, 2021. A brief history of an often pernicious and persistent question of race. All right, and here's the illustration. There's a Roman sword severing the Roman soldier from the Jew and the alleged African. And so let's read. How things change. The current debate about the idea put forward by Mark Dullinger in the new introduction to his Black Power Jewish Politics, that there are elements of white supremacy in the lived experience of American Jews, has left me bemused. The notion that Jews of all people are now being labeled as significant historical beneficiaries of white privilege seems a curious turnabout. For hundreds of years in Europe, there were horribly influential strands of belief that insisted that Jews were somatically as well as metaphorically Black. The discovery of actual Black Jews during the period of the Enlightenment confirmed the association Jews were thought to have with Blacks. Racist anthropology throughout the 19th century and early 20th centuries, and during the period of Nazi domination of Europe, sought to demonstrate that Jews had Black skin, Black blood, and Black origins. So where does this new controversy come from? The ironic redefinition of the color of Jews, I'm down, I believe, the third paragraph.
Yeah, I apologize.
You got
Again,
it? You got it? No, that's all right.
That's
That's okay.
It didn't go.
That's okay. That's okay. You were listening, though. I think a little bit further down.
All right, you just keep reading. I'll catch you.
All right. The ironic redefinition of the color of Jews is being played out in America within the context of the growth of Black Jewish groups in the United States and the further propagation of the idea that all Blacks are descended from the ancient Israelites. Some of these groups doubt the credentials of white Jews, while others resent their exclusion from the Jewish mainstream on grounds of color. This issue came to wider public attention in part as a result of the chance intersection in January 2019 of one particular subgroup of Black Jews, the Black Hebrew Israelites. Some participants in the Indigenous Peoples March and a group of pro-life Catholic high school boys from Kentucky in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The Black Hebrew Israelites merrily saluted the Native Americans as descendants of the lost tribe of Israel, cursed the schoolboys as white Edomites, and found themselves on the TV sets of anyone in the United States who happened to tune in to the day's news. Black Jews in America, one particular subgroup, thus became visible as never before, which helped lead in part to the color of Jews and the meaning and the implications of that color becoming once again a matter of wider debate, joined by everyone from religious communities outside the American Jewish mainstream to a new generation of racial ideologues, to the children of mixed marriages between African American and Ashkenazi Jewish partners, to well-meaning young people eager to engage in the now fashionable calculus of racial typologies and assumed racial deficits and virtues. To understand what an astonishing development this is, we have to return to the history of the Jewish color. For several decades, the study of Black Jews in different parts of the world has been one of the major academic preoccupations. My first encounter with Black Jews came in the fall of 1984, when I was asked by the minority rights groups to go to Sudan and write a report on the situation of Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews in the refugee camps strung along the border with Ethiopia. Ethiopia had been streaming into Sudan on account of political turmoil and famine for years. Rumor had it that the Ethiopian Jews who were dying shockingly in large numbers were being poisoned by Christian refugees. My job was to report on the dreadful situation. Having arrived in Gedera, a scruffy Sudanese border town, it soon became clear to me that something terrible was indeed going on. The first thing I saw was a Jewish cemetery with thousands of recent makeshift graves. Jews were indeed dying at a terrifying rate. A couple of days later, I heard Hebrew spoken in the refugee camps by people who looked like aid workers but were equipped with walkie-talkies and army boots. One day, I met an official with an international aid organization. I revealed to him what I had seen and he revealed to me that he was coordinating an operation with Mossad that would take the Beta Israel covertly to Israel. He swore me to secrecy, promised that when the time came, he would personally let me know the background to the Israeli initiative, which would eventually be known to the world as Operation Moses. A couple of days after the operation was blown by in an Israeli news outlet, the official flew from Israel to London and did as he promised. I went on to write the first book on the operation. Some months later, I was invited to go to South Africa to give a talk on the Israeli operation and on the Beta Israel. My audience was relatively affluent white South African Jewish group, but at the back of the hall, I noticed a number of black men wearing yarmulkes. After the talk, they explained with some hesitation that they were of the Limba tribe and that they were related to the Ethiopian Jews. They claimed to Africa from the Middle East millennia ago. At the time, I was a professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and knew something about Jewish history. I had never heard of any historical Jewish group in Central Africa. The only Jewish group I knew of were the Ethiopian Jews. And even their origins at the time were hotly contested in the scholarly world. Spending some time in Limba villages on the border with Zimbabwe, I became convinced that there was something vividly Semitic about the Bantu tribe and something irresistible about their oral traditions, which painted a picture of migration from a mysterious town called Senna centuries before. I decided to make a roadmap of their oral traditions and follow it through from the village to village, from kraal to kraal, across the African continent. The resulting book, Journey to the Vanished City, described the attempt to recover the lost history of a people. However, it was only with the advent of accessible DNA testing that a window into this obscured past was finally found, one that seemed to confirm the oral tradition of the Limba, that they were a Jewish origin. This project would also contribute a complicating strand to the vexed question of who is a Jew. Both in the case of the Ethiopian Jews and the Limba, I was astonished by the interest shown by the international media in the question of Black Jews. It seemed to show challenge Western ideas about the Jews were supposed to be like. I presented a number of TV documentaries. A section of 60 Minutes covered my work, and hundreds of articles in the world's press were devoted to the topic. Insofar as much as the new problem hinged on the role genetics played in the identity of Black Jews, a development that was eagerly seized upon by aspiring Black Jews throughout the Americas and Africa. This seemed to be a very modern development. However, a few years ago, when I was reading an obscure 18th century German book, I suddenly realized that our current interest in the color of Jews was not new at all. The missionary author of this German tome had noted that a slave from the tiny West Africa kingdom of Loango had mentioned that in his homeland there were Black Jews who celebrated the Sabbath so stringently that they do not speak a word all day. Their graves are made of masonry and adorned with figures of serpents and lizards painted on by those who come to bury the corpse. A couple of years before, I had written a book based on the Huggins lectures I had given at Harvard University. The book was a history of the many African groups that claimed Jewish descent. However, in my book, Black Jews in Africa and the Americas, I had made no mention of the intriguing community of Laengo, whose existence somehow I had missed. It was galling. Piqued, I started following stray leads, and to my astonishment, discovered that the scholars of the European Enlightenment, including some early Jewish masculine, knew all about this community. Indeed, the Black Jews of Laengo and other Black Jews in India, the Sahara, Ethiopia, were a fundamental and critical building block in the onward construction of the concept of race, both in Europe and in the United States. From the middle of the 19th century until the Nazi period, the idea that Jews were multicolored played in the burgeoning idea that if you looked hard enough, all Jews were actually black. They were black in the sense that they all had black blood, and they were all black in the most literal sense that their skin was black. Even if you could be lulled into thinking it was kind of white, in my book, Hybrid Hate, Conflations of Anti-Semitism and Anti-Black Racism from the Renaissance to the Third Reich, I examined assumptions about Jewish color for hundreds of years, which culminated in the absolute and foundational Nazis' conviction that Jews were Negroid. The color of skin was minutely studied subject in the 19th century. One of the greatest authorities on pigmentation was the Englishman John Bideau. He had served with distinction in the Crimean War in the British Field Hospital made famous by Florence Nightingale. And while he was there, did a physical anthropological study of the kinds of the millions of populations incarcerated in the hospitals of Dardanelles. He subsequently went on to analyze the eyes and ears of the peoples of Europe, and thereby laid the foundation of the great pigmentation surveys, which would be carried out in Germany and elsewhere in Europe in the last decades of the 19th century. One of those achievements was to create a meticulously annotated index of negrescence of the population of Great Britain. Jews scored fully 100% on negrescence index. And an earlier, larger, and even larger pigmentation study, which involved nearly 7 million school children, was carried out in Germany shortly after Germany unification in 1871 by the distinguished German scientist Rudolf Virchow. The teachers were provided with a set of instruments that required the children to stand in line with the blondest hair children at one end and the darkest hair at the other end, in a continuum of hair. This way, the children learned that there was a hierarchy of color. In the Virchow study, skin color was shown to be a function not only of what was visible, but also of the relation between hair and eye color. Visible skin color was in fact of no importance for the study. Children were asked to roll up their sleeves to reveal the true color of their arm. In other words, the skin color that you could see with your naked eye was not necessarily the real skin color of the individual. For that, you would have to have some specialized knowledge and partially undress him or her. And there were scientific ways of determining what skin color actually was. I'm going to take it on, shoot it on down to the. Even before the rise of Nazism, Mars' equation of Jews and blacks started to fill the media of the time. Theodor Fritz, the publisher of the anti-Semitic German magazine Hammer, explained that Jews' loathsome character could only be explained through their African ancestry. The acclaimed French novelist, Holocaust denier Louis Ferdinand Céline considered Jews to be entirely African. The Jew is a Negro. The Semitic race does not exist. You know, the interesting thing about this is that, you know, most of us here well, all of us up here on the panel, and pretty probably much most of us that are in the chat room, that have gone to schools here within the United States or here within the West, and when we've learned in school about the Holocaust, how much of us have actually, if any, heard this information that the Jews were considered Africans by the Germans.
Mm.
Nazi,
Yeah.
Nazi and fascist race theorists embraced these ideas enthusiastically. There was a broad consensus among Nazi, Vinci, French, and Italian fascist anthropologists that there were marked Negroid elements in Jews. These ideas were also present in the United States. The Ku Klux Klan regularly lumped blacks and Jews together, as did many homegrown American race theorists. In 1910, Dr. Arthur Talmadge Abernathy, the author of some 50 books, published The Jew a Negro, in which he stated categorically that the Jew of today, as well as his ancestors in other times, is the kinsman and descendant of a Negro. Much of the inspiration for the discriminatory legal codes enacted against Jews, blacks, and others by the Nazis came from Jim Crow laws. However, the main problem with American racial legislation from a Nazi perspective was the Americans did not formally include Jews in the category of colors. But in 1934, Roland Freisler, later presiding judge of the Nazis People's Court, noted that this omission didn't really matter. American legislation could be used without much modification because, as he put it, any judge would place the Jews along with the coloreds, even though they looked outwardly white.
Mm.
Hitler, ain't that something? Hitler argued that Germany had been deliberately nigrified by Jews, whose intent was to weaken and destroy German society through racial contamination. In Mein Kampf, he wrote of the Jews systematically, these Negroid parasites in our national body corrupt our innocent, fair-haired girls and thus destroy something that can no longer be replaced in the world. As Jews today confront charges of white privilege and lament the deteriorating relationship between African Americans and American Jews since the glory days of Jewish participation in the struggle for civil rights, both groups might dwell for a moment on the thought that the color of Jews and blacks has only recently been uncoupled. The hatred of Jews and the hatred of blacks have a common origin. It is indeed a hybrid hate.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful article. Yeah.
Wowzers.
Yeah, that's a bomb right there. I think it's interesting. We had one clip before from the brother in Israel that was going into Nigeria, uniting with the quote unquote so-called lost tribes and connecting with them. And his idea with I Am Israel was that he was attempting to push a movement that, hey, hopefully we can be the last generation that thinks that the tribes are lost. The idea that he said something important in his short clip. He said, you can split the family up, right? And you can have the two groups warring against each other, not realizing that there's an umbrella power above them manipulating the whole thing to get the two arms to fight.
Right.
Like
Let me real quick, Frank, our panelists, if y'all would come on into backstage, we're going to get you guys up here right quick and have a chance to do some chat and discussion on some of this. Go ahead, Brother Jan.
Yeah. So I think that's just interesting, the history of how that was all orchestrated from a Nazi standpoint. And it's just been recent that you had this decoupling, right? So it's really, that's absolutely fascinating when you actually dig into the history for that. Yeah.
And one of the things I think that we have to consider is the fact that Israel, the tribes, the brothers, the families, the clans, have historically been at war with each other, and we've got to come to a place where we can figure out how not to do this. We won't get to the article, another article that I was going to talk about this evening, but you go back into the book of Judges, for example, and Gileadites from Manasseh, if I'm not mistaken, killing Ephraimites who couldn't pronounce the word shibboleth the same way, or Sibboleth the same way that they did. A dialect difference, and they were killing each other. And Israel, Kol Israel, has a history of this. And in fact, the Northern Kingdom, after it left actually rebelled against the house of David. Scripture says they didn't rebel against the house of Judah. They rebelled against the house of David, or Yeshua, ultimately is who the lineage was that it went to. But the Northern Kingdom, when they rebelled 2,745 years ago or something like that, or actually that was when they were exiled. They rebelled even before that. But when that happened, it's in 922, I think. So it's 2,900 years ago. Since that time, the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom have been at war. It's been a civil war going on between us for 3,000 years. Somewhere in here, we've got to stop and say, wait a minute. The adversary loves to have us divided because we can't be effective. We can't do what we're placed in the world to do. We can't be the light that we're designed for. And so let me let's bring in. We've got a couple of these couple of panelists. I'm still missing one, but I've got three, and we'll go ahead and bring them in. We've got Rich. We have brother Money. And have Brother Tom coming in. Somebody's got an open mic that's got big noise going on in the background.
All right, shalom, bros. How you doing? Awesome.
Shalom.
Shalom. Welcome.
Nothing for a week.
Hold on 1 second. Let's do this. Somebody's got a. Do me a favor, Brother Rich.
It might be Brother Rich's fan.
Brother Rich.
Shalom.
You turn that fan on.
Yeah.
Turn that fan. Thank you. How's that?
Thank you. That's. I think that's all. Nope.
Okay.
There's still something.
Could be my refrigerator or something.
Hello?
Just, I would ride the
My life?
button.
That's not good.
Yeah, it's definitely Brother Rich. You got something that's got big noise in the back. I hit the mute from this side, and the noise immediately stopped. Let me while he's figuring out how to solve that, let me start by going to Brother Uwani, who is a Native American, Cherokee descent, Hebrew scholar, and someone who actually I want to get him and some of his crew on here for an interview sometime, because they have been translating a 1st century Hebrew copy of the New Testament that they have gotten from the Cochin, India area, if I'm not mistaken. But brother, if you would like to give us a little bit of information, just give us 3 or 4 minute take on what we've got so far. I know that that's not enough time for you, but go ahead and go ahead and talk to us a little bit. What are your thoughts at this point?
Can he hear you?
I don't hear anything.
Okay. Can everybody else hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
You hear me? Am I on now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I just did an introduction for you.
Because I have heard nothing from Pete for the longest time. Usually there was a red light that when I come on. Well, Brother Jan, the gentleman that he read and the conclusions, he made some really bad errors, because I take this not from the Jewish standpoint. I am of Ephraim and Manasseh. I'm part of the house of Joseph. And he was talking about the Book of Mormon and the different things not going into Britain and Ireland, Scotland, and the Picts not being Jewish. Well, they weren't. The Celtic Empire went from Israel to Turkey, and the original Celtics went all the way up into Ireland, Scotland, Britain. And so the Celtic Empire was actually the Hebrew tribes that were taken out of northern Israel. So yes, they were not Jewish, but they were Ephraim and the others. The tribe of Dan went up into the Danish and different things. The Vikings were Hebrews. Their laws, their structure, everything was Hebrew in their organizations. Now, when it comes to the Book of Mormon, and I'm not advocating that church, not by a long shot, but it does. Hello?
You're still on.
Anyway,
We can hear you.
it does say that they were Manasseh, and Manasseh was not the tribe of Judah. And since that is my tribe, Manasseh and Ephraim, then the Book of Mormon is about that. Now, here's something that just happened. The chief of the Ojibwe, which was part of the Federation of Indians on the East Coast, from Canada all the way down to South Carolina, which the Chalagi, South Carolina and Georgia, the Chalagi, my tribe, the Cherokee, were all part of. Now, when DeSoto, the first Spaniard white man, and his army got there to South Carolina and to Georgia, he wrote a letter to the Pope. And he said, "We have found white natives. And if they didn't open their mouth and you put our clothes on them, you could not discern the difference between them and the Europeans." Okay, now this was the first white man. DeSoto was the first white Spaniard to be in that area, period. And that is a document that he made. So also in getting back to the chief of the Ojibwe, we have records in the Indian nations that go all the way to the time of the Babylonian exile. And
Wow.
he came out with a statement here recently: the Book of Mormon is true. Now, the current Book of Mormon, the LDS Church has farted around with it, and they've made 5,000 changes, 5,000 plus.
Oop.
Oh, you got booted.
Yeah, he just disappeared. He was talking about the Celts, though. One of the things that is interesting about the Celts that was indicative within their culture is it was a highly polygynous culture.
Can you hand me that
That's my
paper I got?
That's my ancestry. That's my ancestry.
That I wrote in.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Brother Thomas, would you like to weigh in with a couple thoughts as we start some discussion here?
Well, I think it's interesting how when you look at where I come from more of the Sephardic Jew, Nigerian, African, Bantu, Limba, and then continuing out through looking genetically, you could see Spain, Portugal, Puerto Rico, Argentina, like that. You could see where they basically said, the Catholic Church said, "Hey, you're a Jew," and they were all like, "Run," and they all took off. So you could see where. But when you look at pictures of my grandmother, great grandmother, you can see that they're basically black. But then you look at me, and I'm not black. So I think that the concept of is a Jew black is you can't deny certain origins or the way certain people might have looked, but things change extremely quick based off of intermixing with the people around you, and I'm a living proof of that. So I thought that was really, really interesting. I think that some of the the things that were in there. I was catching the articles about Marranos and how it is that people were traveling. Something that I don't think was brought up was that a Marrano was a derogatory term, usually from a
Yes.
Jew to crypto Jews or to conversos. Specifically, it was people that were that converted to Catholicism and were basically, as an insult, saying a pig eater, that type of thing. So that was both conversos that truly converted and to cryptos, but still nonetheless labeled Marranos, where we get the word moron from. So I thought that
Wow,
was
that's brother Tom. That's interesting. I mean, I live in New York City, and yeah, so a lot of Hispanics, a lot of Puerto Ricans, right? But the term growing up, I heard it a lot: Moreno, 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 right?
Yep.
Yeah, but I never knew the connection with being Hebrew. Never knew that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that there's I mean, it's one of those things where you can actually trace back lineage wise, like family names, and when you go back to some of those gravestones in different places like Puerto Rico, over in Spain, Portugal, you can actually find gravestones with both modern, what you would consider modern Hebrew block writing, Paleo, and even like Ladino, which was mentioned on the actual gravestone. So, I mean, it's really interesting to like hear some of this stuff. I'm gonna be honest with you. This is like years of research that I've done, like condensed down into 2 hours. So this is like eating like protein of the protein of like research. So this is pretty cool.
Now, I would take a second and address your comment there on Marrano and the fact that a high percentage of the Central and South American populations that got there because they were fleeing Spain and or Portugal. And even I've got a book on my shelf titled Sails of Hope by Simon Wiesenthal. And he makes he's the famed Nazi hunter. But in his book, he makes a very solid case that Cristobal Colon was Jewish and his entire crew was Jewish, and they were going looking for a place for trying to find the lost tribes because they needed a place to take the Jews of Spain and Portugal. Now, I want to use that as a springboard, though, to talk for just a second about a comment here with Mr. Colbert, saying I think at this point everybody everybody might as well be Israel or whatever. I think that's kind of the gist of the point, if I'm reading it correctly. And the fact is the Most High said that he would scatter the seed to the ends of the earth. He wasn't scattering them in one direction only, whether it be to Northern Europe or to South Africa or to Central Africa or to Asia. He scattered the seed thoroughly. The point was to like leaven every people group, every population, so that in the end he can bring back from every tribe, tongue, and nation. That's what we're told is going to happen. The thing is, it's going to be a small percentage of that from across all of it, partly the seed of Abraham, but partly because they will be keeping the commandments of God and they will have the testimony of Yeshua. And so, yes, we will find that Israel, when Israel is finally regathered, we will find that it is composed of brothers from every tribe, tongue, and nation. They won't all necessarily look like ourselves. And,
oftentimes we think of the scattering, we think of the punishment, the judgment. But in actuality, before that, the promise was a blessing to all nations, through Abraham. And so, this is also that coming to fruition, that we're seeing that every nation has an opportunity to have access to that blessing. Right.
And for apocalyptic minister, the remnant does have a description, and we'll be covering that in more detail the next go round. Brother Rich, you look like you're about to start dancing. What you got?
Yes, sir.
He was dancing in the comment section.
Yes. You know, that's amazing, because what you're saying was very, very key there. That it was by Yah scattering his people and the subsequent assimilation and intermingling into the societies that he was able to open up salvation, not just to his people, but also to anyone. And they could become Israel, B'nai Israel. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Praise Yah.
In an article that we didn't touch on this evening, we may get to it later, or we may move on. But Israel has always been faith plus works, and we've mentioned that earlier, and we've looked at other aspects of that. But this is how Naaman could become part of Israel. He's the general of the Syrian army. But Gehazi, who went and ran after him and said, "Hey, wait! You got to pay me for this. You give me a few, a little wedge of silver and some, and he was not the people of Israel. He was cut off, right? So it's as much as we'd like to hang it on direct lineage, we can't. Now, I think the Most High tracks that. I think the Most High ultimately will be able to say, no, I can prove for every single individual how you're connected to Abraham or how you're connected to Jacob. I believe that. But that's not where our faith must lie. Our faith must be in Mashiach and keeping his commandments.
Amen.
Yes.
If I could add, in the Torah, okay, well, first, in the Bible, I believe it's Isaiah, says, my father was a Syrian. All right. Abraham came from Ur of Chaldees. Okay, that was where the Euphrates River goes into the Gulf of Persia. All right. He traveled up the Euphrates, then he traveled west, and that's where he picked up his wife, Sarah. Yeah, and then they came down, but later he sent back his servant to go get a son, a wife for Yitzhak. Okay, that got Rebecca again from a different part, two different DNAs. Then Jacob went back and got Leah and Rachel,
right,
and then Bilhah, and then Zilpah. And so you had three different genetic things. So that's the tribe that it came from. Later, Moshe, he comes from Egypt. Okay. There were, when he counted of the Egyptians that came with him, and remember, he took a mixed multitude. All the slaves of Egypt came with him. And not only that, some of the Egyptians had said, hey, your God, I'm following it. And so we had all that mixed diversity that was added to Israel. Then in the law, the Torah states, if they live my commandments, they will be as one born among you.
Right.
Okay, so
true.
One law for the native and the sojourner.
Yes. So you have all these diverse genetics that are Israel. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Right.
And then you have, now I take this not from the genetics, although I study that too, but I study history, I study genealogy, I study maps, all kinds of things. Most people, because they don't study all maps, Africa, the whole continent, used to be called Ethiopia. All right? So then you have the Queen of Sheba going back to Cush, which is modern Ethiopia. And she took her son because he could not be a king in Israel, but he converted the whole of Ethiopia. That was the first Hebraic worshiping of Yeshua outside of Israel. Then there's the question of Solomon's mind. And a lot of when she came, she brought all this gold. Well, Solomon said, "Oh, wow, all these gold, all these jewels, where did they come from?" And so he sent Hebrews down into Africa. Well, that gold came from Ghana, Africa. And the thing is, in the first map of Ghana made by the British, and it used to be all over the net, but they've scrubbed it. But it showed the coastline of Ghana and the Ivory Coast. And on that map, it had Judah, it had Dan, it had Simeon, it had Levi, and it had one more, it just escapes me. But anyway, all those tribes were marked on the map. And if you study the history of Ghana, there were two main tribes, and the one was the Accra tribe. Now, the capital of Ghana today is called Accra, but the Accrans were Levites. They circumcised, they did everything, and then there were the Ashanti. And the Ashanti also claimed to be Israel. Now, today, even today, back when the British were coming in to, yes, right there, that's the king of Ghana. And you'll notice he has two things around his neck. One is a triangle. Guess what? In the Bible, you read about the golden wedge of Ophir. Ophir was Ghana. The golden wedges came. Now, there's another thing about the Ashanti tribe. The Ashantis have a golden throne. The British came in and fought a war to get that throne from the Ghanese, the Ashanti. And the Ashanti, no king can reign there in Ghana without that throne. But no one can sit on that throne. Why? It's the throne that came down from heaven, and it is there for the real king that the Ghanese Ashanti king is serving, waiting for his return. And so that throne can never be sat on except by the ruler that will come down from heaven. Does that sound familiar to anybody?
No, not at all.
So, you want the truth about the heritage of the Africans, and these are former kings. These are former rulers. Now, there's a couple of shots of just regular men that wear the now, if you look real close at some of them, now here there's some sword. In the next, they have the two golden bulbs. That's the handle of the swords, but they are guards to guard the throne and the king. And this, the blurred one, that's the sword. But this one below it, the next one, those two are guards, Levitical guards with their mark, the golden wedge of Ophir. So all of these things tie back to the Levites and to the house of Israel. It's right there. In fact, in their history, there's the handle of the sword and the sword. In their history, you can read where the Ashanti sent an ambassador to the Accrans. And in order for the ambassador to walk in, because they had their tabernacle, you could not enter in to where they were unless you were circumcised. So the Akron tribe circumcised the ambassador of the Ashanti. And he was incensed and went back, and the Ashanti went to war with the Akrans. Whoa! What it means? You can't enter in unless you're circumcised? Does that sound familiar? I mean, the house of Israel is and these were in Africa long before the diaspora of Babylon. Okay, this was back from King Solomon. So we have that And then I personally am Chalagi and Irish. Now it's interesting. The Chalagi tell, and not from the Book of Mormon or anything, and all the Indian tribes, they tell how they came across the ocean in a boat and they settled in this land, the Americas. So we have that as our heritage. But then in my Irish, when I was looking up my Irish heritage, the Book of Kells, do you know that every Irishman, all of them in toto, are the house of Ephraim? And when Moshe left Egypt, okay, that history book goes all the way to Adam. The lineage, my lineage is in it, all the Irish lineage is in it. And you're in Ireland, every Irishman is a king. You're either a high king or a low king or a mid king. I happen to be of the high kings. My lineage goes through King Oleomold, and it goes all the way back, and it records that my great ancestor was cured of a snake bite by Moses. Does that sound familiar? I mean, you have the lineage that goes back. So, and the whole thing is what Pete said. Abraham was promised that his children will come from every corner of the earth. He was promised that his children would be a blessing to the entire earth. God knew he was going to spread us and our, so every part of Israel, all the tribes, not just the Jews. What you guys did tonight was wonderful about the Jews, but they made some incorrect assumptions. Pastor or Brother Yah, I believe. I can't read, it's small on my phone. But he said, you know, the Indians in the Book of Mormon is not true. They're not Jews. Well, damn right they're not Jews. The Book of Mormon itself says they're Ephraim and they're Manasseh. And in fact, just lately, we have many tribes with many records that go back to Babylon. All right. And my tribe is the keeper of the sacred flame that came down from heaven. Does that sound familiar? That lit the altar. And that has been a responsibility of my tribe to keep that fire burning to today, from the time it came down from heaven, that was brought across the sea on the ships with my ancestors. But the chief of the Ojibwe of the Iroquois Federation from Canada, and he has the records that he took to Israel, and they were astonished and said, "You are Israel?" And he said, "Yes, we have the records to prove it." Now, what's so damn funny is the Book of Mormon is owned by these Utah LDS, and they deny us Indians, even though it's about our history, not theirs. And they don't recognize it. In fact, in the Book of Mormon, it says that this is not for the people, it's for the Indians. Give it back to them. Because what happened during the time of Joseph Smith, the Indians were going through a genocide. There were over 80 million Indians in America at that time. Today, if you want a pure brown-skinned Indian, there's only 3 million of them in the United States. From 80 million, and I'm not talking about Canada or South America, I'm just talking about the U.S. They're from 80 million to 3 million. And now the rest of us are like me. I'm an Irish Indian, German, Scottish Indian. But I was raised by my Cherokee Chalagi grandmother, so I identify as a Chalagi. But the point is, Israel is every color. We have been gone to every walk of life, every continent, everywhere there are people. I guarantee you, there are Hebrews.
Amen.
I'm not a Jew, although I do have one Jew in my registry. My Chalagi great-grandfather was in, before the Civil War, he had 2 wives. One was an indentured Jewish slave that he bought, and the other was a native. Now, I'm descended from that white indentured Sephardic Jew, but that doesn't mean that we're not every color. And so, yes, I get passionate on this because I say, do you know, here's something else. The Mongols are like the Irish in toto. They're Ephraim in toto. And you have other populations, the Celtics. Now, there's an interesting statement in Zechariah chapter 3 about the servant. And let me see the verse here. It's toward the end. This is verse 9 of Zechariah 3. And I'm reading it not from a King James translation, but this is from the Aleppo Codex in Hebrew translated to English. You can find that translation at Chabad.org. It's spelled with a CH because it's Hebrew, Chabad. But listen to this. For behold the stone that I have placed before Joshua. 7 eyes are directed to one stone. Behold, I untie its knots, says the Lord of hosts. I will remove the iniquity of the land in one day. What knot is he talking about? You go to the Celtic culture, what is the one thing they have is the knot. It's the knot of tied Israel until it's untied by Yehuda. And here it is, a thing in Zechariah chapter 3. So, you know, there are so many. And when it comes to the Nazis and Hitler, do you know that the swastika, he turned it around? But if you go to the backward, the true swastika, not the backward Nazi swastika, you can find it in India, you can find it in China, you can find it in America, you can find it in Africa, you find it on every continent. You know why? That swastika is the Aryan people, not the fake lie that Hitler did. The true Aryans are the house of Israel that left Israel and they went to the 4 corners of the earth and they discovered each other. And so they turned halfway back. They went halfway across the world and left that as their mark of the diaspora of Israel. And then, as Hasatan does, he takes the truth, he twists it inside out, and then uses it as his own. One of my Indian grandmother had a wonderful saying. God creates, Hasatan imitates, and man must differentiate.
Yes, very good. Absolutely. And you hit on some important things there. I know for me, one of the big eye openers for me a few years ago was watching a video by Elder Kabir about a trip that he took to back to the Yoruba tribes in Nigeria, I believe. And for me, it was a real awakening. I guess I sort of understood, but I'd never stopped to really ponder the close connection that parts of Africa have with Israel that are undeniable, as you know, these pictures. Now, the pictures that I put up are pictures that Brother Ioani sent me recently as we were having some different conversations on different parts of Israel and the fact that Israel indeed was scattered to the ends of the earth. But Brother Rich, give me something.
Yes, sir. Hey, you know, I was, you know, there is a scripture, a text that says Ephraim follows after the east wind. He sniffs up the east wind. And so I was particularly interested in that part of, the sharing here tonight. My wife is Japanese, And it's quite ironic that Japan's first written language was kanji, which then they adopted, which is kind of Chinese. And then the hiragana, which is the only pictorial language left in the earth. But there's an interesting third language in Japan, which is called katakana. And katakana, kata is a family, and it's very pronounced because that family's name is all over Japan. And I learned this from a friend that I met online and befriended, Dr. Arimasa Kubo. And what I found out was, and through some of his writings, and I think he shared a thing, you might be able to find it on YouTube. It's kind of like a Ripley's Believe It or Not, and they kind of gave him like a cameo appearance where he went in and did a lot of things. But there's many, many things in Japan that parallel Israelite custom and culture, somewhat more so, strikingly. The language, katakana language, means the kata's writing, is it's an informal way of writing in Japanese, and it has 22 or 23 letters that are identical in form and are almost completely identical in form and sound of Paleo-Hebrew Syrophoenician script in its written and spoken forms, which is quite interesting. And the idea, and the reason I bring this up is my wife's father passed recently, and she had to file and update her family ancestry, including our marriage and things like that. They already had that, but anytime someone dies, it's quite patriarchal in Japan. And at times, anyone saying they've been doing this for like 2,500 years too. So their genealogies and attentions to detail are kind of without precedent in the earth. The only other one being the ancient fathers of Israel. But so anyway, it's interesting because there was like 7,000 families that came to Japan in its early settlement, which is how this language came into being. Some of the interesting things about that is that Japan has an Omakoshi festival, which is in the 7th month, which correlates to our Feast of Tabernacles. Its length is about a month. The Omakoshi ark that they use in that, now there's some other pagan ones, and they're like Asherim and all that, but those are in different local cults or whatever. But and my wife also comes, at least on her mother's side, comes from a priestly family of Shinto priestly family. And so it's very important for her to keep her family registry up, and the government keeps track of everyone in the country like this. And so anyway, the amazing thing is there's a legend, I know you've probably seen it, a legend of these creatures called Tengu. Okay. Now the Tengu were the people who lived in the mountains. They were spirits. And they brought down to the villages Torah no Maki, which means the law in Japanese. And when people violated, that's why the Tengu are shown often with a red face and bloodshot eyes. They would literally come down and slay and kill these people. And you really kind of wonder, where could they have gotten this? And it's so, the same words like wrestling, Shmo wrestling, that did not originate in Japan. That originated in the Levant, and in the Levant they would put clay jars, they would tie them to their heads, and when they would wrestle with each other, the one whose clay jar broke lost the match. But originally that was brought as a sacrificial offering to the emperor in Japan. Shmo wrestling. Shmo means the name. Shem. It comes from the Hebrew. It's not of Japanese origin. There's a lot of these things that are in the background of Japanese culture that most Japanese are completely oblivious of today. You know, so that's something that was very interesting. And the original Shmo wrestling exposition put on for the Japanese emperor there was only one contestant, and he wrestled with the spirit. And the custom of casting salt into the ring was to purify the ring and make it kadash, or separate for the performance. And but the original Shmo wrestler wrestled with a spirit, not with another participant. And then, of course, later on, it kind of went to that. So the amazing thing, when you were mentioning about Afghanistan, the Pashtun, some of the Pashtun people, they identify as B'nai Binyamin, or the sons of Benjamin. Which is kind of odd, because not a lot of the Benjamites went in to Babylonian captivity. But everything that was said here tonight is right on point, because when Alexander the Great gave leave to the Israelites that were in his dominion, and this was in the early Hellenist period, he allowed them to go back to their homelands. A lot of Israelites, they moved east. They didn't return. And of course, we see that later on, that, not really many returned, 40,000 or something like that. But so anyway, yeah, this was an incredible presentation tonight. And I'm just so thankful to be here.
Brother Tom.
I
Go
would
ahead.
like to add about Japan. I have a dear friend. He's a Levitical priest. He didn't know he was a Levitical priest at the time. He was a missionary for the LDS Church, and he was a missionary in Japan. But he heard about a temple up in the mountains for the Tengu. So he went and investigated. And lo and behold, what did he find? An exact duplicate of the temple of or the tabernacle, the 2 rooms and different stuff, and everything, the priests and everything were keeping the Torah, and he was amazed. But then he read.
Yeah, that's true. Several Shinto temples are based on the same dimensions as the house that Solomon built for Yah.
Correct.
That's correct.
But also he talked to the priests, and he said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We are waiting." And he says, "For what?" Because the world is going to go into chaos, and the priests have to offer an offering to Yah. And our priests, when they offer that offering, will save the world. Does that sound familiar to anything?
Yep. And when you talk about go ahead.
Let me pass this off to Brother Tom, and let's see what he keeps reaching for the mic there.
Oh wait, what were we? What?
No, I wanted to have you put some input here, brother.
Well, I think some of this stuff is really, really interesting. To be honest, some of the Native American tribe stuff is right on the money. It's kind of weird, because once you start talking to certain people, they'll automatically think you're talking about Mormonism and things like that. I'm like, no, this stuff was already understood from prior. You read through even the founding fathers, like the Declaration of Independence, and you read through their diaries. They talk about the actual Hebrew people being here, even like way back when. So this stuff was more hijacked, if you will. But yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. I also think it's difficult because of some of these types of influences in people's like mindsets. When you start bringing up Native American Indians and the Israelites, people think Mormonism. It's also the same thing with Israel and Jews. And that's one of the things that, I mean, I think that what this did was a good presentation, or it was long-winded, but I think pretty extensive about why it is that all Jews are Israel, but not all Israel are Jews. But you can't necessarily blame like people that are looking to read their Bible. So, and it's just, I'm just pulling up the Holman Christian Standard Version Bible. And I know that like, everybody is like, no, I'd stay away from that. Well, guess what? Other people don't. When you look in James and it says, James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. And where is it? There you go. It has a little tiny little thing there you can click for some commentary. You're like, oh, what is he talking about? Commentary literally says Jewish people scattered throughout the Gentile lands who spoke Greek and were influenced by Greek culture. The 12 tribes. It literally says 12 tribes. But they're going to like limit that down to the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Sephardic Jew, but that's just ridiculous. It's frustrating. So I really hope that this is a blessing to anybody who stumbles upon it, anybody that's watching this. And I can't wait to see what happens next. But some of this stuff, Uwani, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yuwani, yeah. It's
Yeah,
short for Yuwani Gathlasuli, which is branch buzzard in English. But Yuwani is easy for most people to get.
Yeah, you're striking on some stuff that's like I'm like, it's hard for me to even talk to people about this because you're like they immediately go to that Mormon thing and you're like, man, it's no.
Yeah.
Brother Uwani, what book would you recommend to people who are looking in on the chat that they wanted to get a cursory understanding? What book would you recommend that you've come across in your experiences?
Well, there's lots of books, but I've been part of B'nai Emunah. We take Paleo Hebrew and we translate it. In fact, we just finished this book right here, which is in the original Hebrew, the Book of Mysteries. It's called the Book of Revelations. And it's from Cochin, India, and it's the Travancore documents. And we found this, or Dr. Miles Jones did, in the Cambridge Library. And this is known as Cambridge MS 00-1-16-2, because all these old Hebrew manuscripts are numbered. But Dr. Jones traces the Hebrew from the time of Yeshua to today. All right? What most people don't know is the very last apostles was the Irish prophet St. Patrick. Okay? The Catholics made him a saint, but he was before the Catholics in Ireland. He was the last of the Celtics that had come after the diaspora from the Romans, and he was the last group of apostles with the Shekinah glory. That means the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of smoke. You read Dr. Miles Jones' books, The Writing of God, and there's 3 or 4. He details how the diaspora came. Now, that I would recommend that series of books, because that would bring you from Yeshua and how it went, and the persecutions and the Catholic Church and the Greek taking over, and then killing the Hebrews and denying the Hebrew Church, and the Waldensians that preserved it. And we have the Waldensians here in America still, and it goes back. Now, the Cochin, India, this book here, Janice, one of the head translators, is going to soon be putting that for sale. I have free copies now, but I don't have enough to distribute, except to close friends. But that Coaching India, we discovered, because we go through all the manuscripts, and there's lots of Hebrew manuscripts hidden in the Vatican and everything. But what they were Greek manuscripts that were translated, retranslated by Greek scholars that knew Hebrew. And so they changed the Hebrew scriptures to conform with the Greek scriptures. But the scriptures we found in Cochin, India are pure Hebrew 1st century without any Greek impositions, and all the markers are 1st century Hebrew. So
wow.
Stay tuned with Pete, because I will be giving him the information, and as soon as this stuff, I will, because we are translating the entire New Testament from original 1st century Hebrew.
Oh boy, yeah.
Yeah, and we're kind of headed off track. We probably need to wrap it up here, but I'll tell you this, brother. Certainly he shared that with me. It's been a couple months ago, but even as early as I can remember, when I started understanding Torah and started walking Torah 12 or 13 years ago, I felt solidly enough in my spirit to make the claim that everything had originally been written in Hebrew and it would be revealed in the latter days. And that's exactly what's starting to happen now. And that was about 10 or 12 years ago when I made some of those statements. And I'm sure others have too, but yeah, it does not come as a surprise. I'm just excited to see what happens when it comes.
That's great. That's great. Because what brother Ioana, you give a good point with that, because we knew historically from Eusebius and some of the early church fathers that the earliest manuscript of Matthew was written in Hebrew, right? But they don't mention about the other books of the New Testament having also been written in Hebrew initially as well. You assume that, right? But they, and they've always taught, their New Testament is in Greek, right? But if you look at the early church father, they'll tell you Matthew was written in Hebrew originally. So it's good, to have that additional piece of information. And the Nazarene knew that, right? So the Nazarene knew that, right? So yeah, very interesting. Yeah.
I would like to do one thing on the topic. When the oldest African synagogue outside of Israel is in Tunisia. And there's an island that's part of Tunisia that's off Tunisia, but there's a synagogue there. And in that synagogue is the lintel from the original temple of Babylon, Solomon. And when the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple, the Kohanim of Levi left and brought that with them and established that synagogue there. In scripture, in Ezekiel, God tells us in the last days, you have to have an offering of righteousness. That's Malachi. When the Levites, but in Ezekiel, it says they have to be descended from Zadok. Zadok. And, the Kohanim in Tunisia is from Zadok.
From Zadok line, okay.
The Kohanim in Japan are from Zadok. The Kohanim in Ghana, Africa are from Zadok. I have been researching this for many years because I want those gentlemen to purify themselves. And in scripture, it talks about in Moses chapter 1, Deuteronomy chapter 1, and Nehemiah chapter 1. It's a prayer that Moses gives when the children of Israel return and keep the law in the countries where I have driven them, then I will come and gather Israel. Everybody is waiting for the second coming, but Yeshua and Jehovah have told us we have to, and all through Deuteronomy, all through from Exodus And to Deuteronomy, the Lord says, if you keep the commandments I give you this day.
Yeah, and it's you and your sons.
That's right.
It's you and your sons. That's 2 generations that's got to keep it.
Well, no, it says all of them in the last days,
Right.
Deuteronomy 30. So when we remember him, and then in Psalms, it's interesting. It says, I believe it's 128. It might be 124. When David is searching for the Lord and he's giving a prophecy about Ephraim and Benjamin and Manasseh, and they're doing it. And what happens toward the end of that chapter, he says, in the tabernacles. He didn't say tabernacle. And in the scriptures, it lists the tabernacle of David 7 times. And the last few times is about our day. When we remember to keep that covenant with the Levites so they can do the offering in righteousness, and we raise the tabernacle, because we can't do a temple. God says only where he set his name. But the one thing all of Israel and everybody misses, that where he says, when I put you in the land and I give you rest from all of your enemies round about, then where I set my name is the only place you can do. Okay. Is there peace in Israel? Are there any enemies giving them a break? No. So we have to raise that tabernacle, give the offering of righteousness, and remember the covenant that God made to the Levites, the Zadokim, the sons of Zadok. And then we will have the kingdom of God on the earth. The Shekinah glory will return. Anyway, that's.
Amen. We definitely look for that day. Definitely look for that day. Gentlemen, any last words? Just 60 seconds or less. We're going to wrap this up.
Hey, thank you to the panel. It was a blessing. Thank you, gentlemen, for reading the articles, and for the folks in the chat coming on to spend this time with us as we just do our part to try and make awareness of how deep the scattering was. And for the gentlemen that came on afterwards for the panel discussion, we thank you so much. It's been a real blessing and a treat for us to listen to you guys as you share your wisdom.
Amen, amen, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it so much.
Shalom.
Absolutely. Good one.
Shalom. I love you, bro.
All right,
Yes,
gentlemen.
shalom.
Well, may the Most High be with you this week and bless you on your journey, and absolutely continue to pray for it and lean forward for the restoration of Kol Israel and the glory of our King. Amen, amen.
Amen. Amen.
Blessed.